Hey, good morning. Hey, we're going to get started because I think we have a jam-packed day planned, and so we just want to kind of stay on track a little bit. I think there are some people who will be trickling in because a ticket machine downstairs is having issues because it's a Tuesday morning. So happy pre-day. I'm so excited to have you here for our Reaffirming DEI and Med Ed. So cultivating communities, sparking change, and then also driving progress. And we know during these uncertain times, it can be very challenging. So it's great to see your faces here and kind of set the tone and set the environment for the work that we're doing within and outside of these walls. I'm Sri Nadation. I'm one of the APDs at Duke and the rising president for ADIM, the core chair of DEI as well too. And so I'm one of the chairs for our workshop today.
Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Ken Kennedy, one of Shree's colleagues down at Duke University. I serve as one of the assistant program directors for our residency program, and then also one of the faculty members within the department as well. So very nice to meet you all, and thank you all for being here.
And I'm Adam McFarland. I'm an assistant residency program director at Case Western in Cleveland, and one of the co-chairs of the core DI virtual conference that happens in September every year. This year on September 17th. So keep an eye out for an email for that as well.
And then we're just going to go through just a few disclosures. So we're just going to list this here so you can take a look. But these are our disclosures for our speakers. We have a lot of talented speakers from all across the country doing this amazing work who will be here to kind of share their expertise. So really we're helping to curate kind of everyone's talents and skills for this workshop. So here's our disclosure list, and then we'll talk a little bit more about that later.
Once again, I wanted to extend a thank you to all of you all for being here. Definitely don't take it lightly that you spent your money, spent your time to come here to be with us, to kind of talk through these things, especially since we are in this climate that we're in currently. Also want to say thank you to all the speakers who are going to be here, sharing their knowledge and their expertise, so that way we can all be better as we move forward. So today our objectives are simple. We're going to try our best to analyze the impact of anti-DEI legislation on medical education and proposed policy reform strategies. We're going to also formulate innovative strategies for recruiting and retaining faculty and learners based on evidence. Next, we're going to try our best to design and evaluate inclusive environments in didactic and clinical settings to enhance equity, engagement, and through upstander training and restorative justice. And then lastly, we'll develop and justify a strategic action plan to lead, sustain, and overcome barriers in DEI initiatives.
Okay, so we're just going to do a quick run through the agenda for today. We have a lot of amazing talks, a lot of amazing speakers, and a lot of really great content to go through today. So starting at 8:30, we'll have our keynote address, the fabulous group of speakers about facing an anti-DEI era, analyzing the SCOTUS repeal effects, and advocating for continued progress. We're going to transition afterward into some lightning talks on different strategies for mentorship, recruitment, and creating inclusive environments. We'll take a networking and social break and then work through 2 workshop activities on upstander workshops and creating inclusive spaces through restorative justice practices. From 11 to 11:15 will be approaches and best practices to integrating health equity into medical education and clinical practice. And then we'll end with activity call to action about moving DEI forward and strategies before we wrap up and take it home.
And just before we start, I think in knowing how this climate is kind of outside of the walls here, we definitely wanted to set some ground rules just so we can all grow and learn together. And I think these times are challenging. There's a lot of threats outside of these walls, a lot of barriers, a lot of challenges that can kind of leave us kind of like disheartened about what's going on. But I think what really grounds me are, looking around this room and knowing the people who are doing this work, because I think that's really powerful. Because I think that the issue is that sometimes we feel we're alone, but we know DEI is relational work, and so really we need to kind of lean into that and lean into each other to really be a force for each other. And so I love this quote here that says, "There's no comfort in growth and no growth in comfort." So as educators, I think we all know it's in that zone of proximal development, right? Where you're a little bit uncomfortable, that you truly get to learn and really get to grow. And so I hope that today we can kind of grow together and kind of set the platform and the foundation from the knowledge that we're about to gain. And I did a Teaching for Equity fellowship a few years ago, and I love this quote that they talked about, because I think a lot of times as an educator, I think I'm creating a safe space, but I don't know what my learners learners feel. And that was really kind of eye-opening to me, that actually I'm asking them to be brave to step into this space with me to learn and grow. And so I love this quote. I'll just read it real quick. But together we will create brave spaces. There's no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars and we have all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to be more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we know. We will not be perfect. The space will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish for, but it is our brave space together, and we will work on it side by side. And I hope that's what we'll do today, is create a brave space where we can all step in, show up as we are, and kind of grow with curiosity as we talk about these topics. So we wanted to do, I know time is a little bit short, but wanted to do like what we call like a whole person introduction, because I think so often we only talk about like, hi, I'm Sri, I'm the APD from XYZ, right? And that's it. And that's all you hear about each other. But I think it's good to know that like we are humans, we have our own struggles, we have our own identities that include part of that being a physician or being a medical student and learning and growing. And so this is really where the whole body introduction is really kind of encompasses more of who we truly are. So at your table, and if you're by yourself at a table, feel free to jump over to another one. But you'll say your name, maybe if you want to share your pronouns, if you feel comfortable, any type of self-identification that you have, institution and role, which you see a lot of times we just do 1 and 4 and that's it. And then any other social identities that kind of matter to you. So I can give a quick example. I'm Serena Dation. I use she, her pronouns. I identify with being an immigrant to a family where my parents sacrificed everything to leave. There's 7 brothers and sisters in India to come here, and so I carry that very strongly with the work that I do. I work at Duke. I'm an APD there and do work at a GME level and through the School of Medicine. And my social identity is I'm also a mom to 4 kids and stay very busy and love to be active and love to be around people who do this work, because I think it really helps me to feel very fulfilled and excited. So less than a minute-ish, and then it kind of tells you a little bit more, about that person. So if you want to just take a couple minutes to kind of go around your table, that would be great, and then we'll kind of kick off with our keynote speaker. That's good. Gives them 15 minutes or so. Oh, I have this.
Are you okay?
Yeah, no, okay. It's not live. I mean, I've been doing workshops.
Sorry, like the same person who wants to take a picture at the lunch break. Hashtag Yes. I'm sure it was a strange jump for later. Did you go on?
Relatively. Not one of the biggest. My wife did, right? She's in South Korea. She's not. It's just rejected.
Hey guys, we're going to bring it back together then. It's good to hear everyone talking. Hey guys, we're going to bring it back together. I don't want to tap on this, but I love seeing you guys talk and kind of like, like we said, DEI work is relational work. And so it really is building networks within and outside of these walls. And you probably have learned a lot about each other. I saw a lot of laughing, a lot of stories being told, because we are the stories that we carry, and the people who kind of created the path for us. I think those are the important things that we share with each other, aside from just our professional identities, that can keep us grounded in those hard times that have come and will come as we're doing this work to kind of advance equity for our patients and for our families as well, and for this country. So what we're going to do is kind of kick off our keynote speaker, and then we have a lot of kind of mixed didactics. So we'll have some lightning talks after that. We'll then break it up for some workshops where you actually get to do some role playing, and don't worry, it'll be a safe and brave space that we could be uncomfortable together to practice saying some of the words that we need to keep our learners safe. And then after that, we'll have some curriculum and end up with a closeout. So I'm going to let Adam kind of kick us off for the intro, and I'm just going to change to you guys' slide.
All right. So I guess if our speakers for the next session want to come up and get prepared, we're ready for you. So really excited to have the next group coming and talking to us. I've had the opportunity to hear the people on this panel in this discussion speak several times. I'm really, every time, thrilled to learn and grow from the experiences and expertise that they share. We've got Doctors Pierre, Brown, Smith, Auda, and Hobunwa talking about essentially anti-DEI legislation in this area, where I think a lot of that's really on the top of our minds right now as we adapt to what feels like changes day after day, and institutional policies changing day after day, and sort of how we can sort of incorporate our advocacy and our practices into the current era, and continue to advocate moving forward. So with that, I'll turn it over to. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Morning. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Valerie Pierre, and we're very excited to give this talk to you all today. We're going to be discussing reaffirming DEI in medical education, specifically a review on how the anti-DEI legislation that passed a few years ago affects the UIM pipeline into emergency medicine. So these are disclosures for everyone. And we're going to start with everyone briefly introducing ourselves and where we work, okay?
Trying to steal my identity there. My name is Cortland. I am an associate professor and vice director of DEI at Carolinas.
Good morning, I'm Italo. It's a pleasure to meet you all. Emergency physician at Stanford, also social justice and health equity curriculum thread lead for the School of Medicine.
Hey everyone, can you hear me? Okay. I'm Manny Hobunwa. I am assistant professor at UT Southwestern, also director of HEAL, which is a leadership development course for residents and fellows around the country, sponsored by UT Southwestern. Really excited to be here today.
Testing. Can you guys hear me? Okay. I'm Dahlia Oda. I'm an emergency medicine physician at Henry Ford Hospital and also a clinical assistant professor at Michigan State University College of Human Medicine, and I have no financial disclosures.
Once again, my name is Valerie Pierre. I'm one of the faculty advisors for the DEI committee at the University of Maryland.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kristen Smith. I am faculty at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm also the sub-I director and the assistant dean for pre-medical experiences.
So for the outline today, we're going to talk about the history of affirmative action in this country. We're going to talk about the WAMC definition that's changed over the years for underrepresented in medicine. We're going to go into a little bit more detail about the SCOTUS repeal of affirmative action that passed about a year ago. Then we're going to kind of go up to speed and talk about some of the prior anti-DEI legislation that's occurred, and then our current institutional practices. And then we're hoping for some time to have an open forum about what we're doing at our institutions and what's happening at your institutions, maybe collaborate on some ideas about that, okay? So by the end of this talk, you should be able to describe how legal rulings have impacted the pipeline of your IMs going into emergency medicine specifically, discuss the future implications of how the repeal of affirmative action has affected the pipeline of underrepresented minorities into medicine, and then also reviewing the best practices across our departments in our residency and fellowship training programs to maintain diverse faculty and trainees in spite of the repeal of affirmative action. So without further ado, we'll get started.
So this is not a history lesson, but in terms of affirmative action, we really will be discussing affirmative action in relation to equitable access to education in this country, because it does frame all of the rest of the work that we'll be talking about later on today. So, as defined by the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, affirmative action is any measure adopted or to correct or compensate for present, past, or to prevent future discrimination. Really, in the United States, there have been several different federal laws and also landmark cases that have been very important to affirmative action. But when we look at education, the first one was really the Brown versus Board of Education of 1954. Which we see here, which was the landmark case where segregation in public schools was struck down. This really overturned the doctrine at the time, which was separate but equal, which was established by Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. Moving forward, really the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was next, which was the federal law that prohibits discrimination based on race, color, creed in public accommodations and also in employment.
Can people hear without the microphone? Do we need the microphone for recording? Okay. Okay, so now we're going to move forward even more and talk about Regents of the University of California, Davis versus Bakey. So Bakey, this individual in the picture right there, he applied to med school. He applied many, many times, got rejected many, many times. And each school pretty much said that it was his age. He was in his mid-30s, which I kind of take offense to. That's not old. But, you know, this was a slightly different time. This was 1978. He actually filed a suit against the state of California. He went in their constitutional state law and said that UC Davis, again, this is all med school, so UC Davis Medical School, that their admission practices were unconstitutional. And that's because they had a general admission pool, and then they also had what's called their special admission pool, and they saved 16 spots for it. And the special admission pool included anybody that was considered a minority at the time, and the definition was kind of very vague, as well as anybody that was economically disadvantaged. So it went to the Supreme Court of the state. They basically said that the quota, so having that 16 set reserved seats was unconstitutional, but that the state and the institution could still make race or ethnicity-based decisions. So it was kind of a middle standpoint for the decision. Then we're going to move forward to 1969, but we're going to stay in California. So this is when California passed Prop 209, which basically said that the state couldn't consider any of these things, so race, sex, color, ethnicity, national origin, in all of these different categories. So public employment, public education, and that's really where it matters here, and public contracting. So again, all of the UC schools, so University of California, they are all public institutions. So how did Prop 209 actually affect students there? Because we're living in a similar era. So we already have error. We already have, history telling us what is going to happen. So what actually happened then? So Zachary Bleemer used an effects on effects model and basically collected data on all freshman applicants to the entire UC system. And he collected data on individuals that applied from 1994 to 2002. The data included demographic information as well as information from their high schools. So how were their test scores? What were their SAT scores? What colleges they applied to? What majors they had? How well they did in college? Did they get any advanced degrees? And then even how their salary was after graduation. And you can see here that after Prop 209, the percent of Black and Hispanic individuals that applied and enrolled in the UC system significantly declined. So it's around here on the left at like 10%. Even more striking though, he looked at individuals that had high academic index, and that's basically a measure of their high school grades times test scores. And he found that individuals with a high academic index dropped even lower. So they pretty much did not apply to the selective UC schools at all. So UC Berkeley is one of the most selective UC schools, and you can see that the admission rate dropped by around 30% for Black and Hispanic students. And then those Black and Hispanic students that had a lower academic index actually fell out of the UC system altogether. So the ones with the high academic index didn't apply and enroll at the selective institutions. The ones with the lower academic index completely fell out of the public system completely. So we're in medicine, we always want to think about the counter arguments. So what are some counter arguments for affirmative action or Prop 209? So the main one that people will say is this mismatch theory, which basically says that minority students at these highly selective institutions, we're doing them a disservice because they're not set up to succeed there. And so they should go to an institution that won't be as academically rigorous. That doesn't play out. So after Prop 209, and again, this is just an individual case study, Black and Hispanic students were less likely to earn undergrad degrees, earn bachelor's degrees in STEM, enroll in medical and law school, and earn other graduate degrees. And then going to a financial argument, so it actually made a huge financial difference for them. So not only did they have all of those lower graduation rates, lower degrees in medicine and law, but they also had a significant decline in their wages for years after. And this study showed that Prop 209 caused a cumulative decline in the number of early career underrepresented minorities, Californians, earning over $100,000 by at least 3%. So that's a major decrease. So not only is it bad for them in terms of their personal growth, but also just bad financially for them.
That's me. You're good. So who is URM? So prior to 2003, historically URM, I guess, has been underrepresented minorities, referred to specific and ethnic groups that were systemically excluded from medical education. And so prior to 2003, the AAMC used this definition where they defined URM as those who were Black, Mexican American, Native American, including American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians, and then those who were mainland Puerto Rican population. And the focus really at that time was to increase enrollment and opportunities for these groups specifically, since they had been there had been a lot of barriers to medical school admissions for these specific groups, and so they were trying to undo that by using this definition. Moving from URM to URIM, so in 2004, the AAMC broadened this definition, so they moved away from listing specific groups and moved to this definition here I'll read shortly, but the reason this happened in 2004 was 2003, there was a Supreme Court case of Bruder versus Bollinger. In that case, deemed that race could be used for admissions to schools to increase student body diversity, although you couldn't use quotas per se. That was deemed unconstitutional. And so at that time, URM, AAMC moved from URM to URIM. And so how they defined it moving forward and today is that racial and ethnic populations that are underrepresented in the medical profession relative to the numbers in the general population. And so they believe that at this definition kind of moved from this more static, had to be these specific groups, to a little bit more dynamic and acknowledge that maybe locally diversity or underrepresentation might be a little different than nationally, and that there were changes over time. And so what they attempted to do with this was, how this affected DI efforts more broadly, is that it shifted focus towards inclusivity, allowed for changes in evolving demographics of general population, both locally and nationally, and then encouraged comprehensive data collection and reporting. So medical schools were using local data to drive their admissions processes. In addition to, since this definition changed, there's been a lot more emphasis on understanding who makes up our URIM physician workforce, so we can maybe hold ourselves a little bit more accountable moving forward.
So, as Dr. Oda just said, the underrepresented medicine definition was really put into place by the AAMC so that we could then utilize more recruitment efforts to make our physician and our overall healthcare workforce look more like the populations that we're serving, so that we could take it from a national level to more individual levels, because obviously in different communities there's going to be higher populations of certain individuals, and making sure that we have better reflection. But how has that use of the definition actually changed some of the statistics? And unfortunately, there has been some studies that show not that much. So in 2021, there was a study done out of UCLA that found that unfortunately for certain subgroups, there has been little change in their percentage of the physician workforce over several decades, and specifically for Black males. So in 1940, 2.7% of all physicians in the US were Black or African American males at that time. In 2018, the percentage was 2.6%. So very little change, right? The overall number has changed because obviously the percentage of individuals in this country who identify as Black or African American has increased since 1940, but the actual percentage has not changed at all. What does that mean about how successful we are with using this new definition in terms of underrepresented in medicine? Are we doing enough? These are questions that really this data should start to make you ask yourself. Again, as Dr. Oda had already said, underrepresented in medicine, really that definition is to allow institutions to be more inclusive, to look more so at their data-driven diversity, equity, inclusion, recruitment, and also retention efforts. But also, unfortunately, for different subgroups, we're not doing that much, or we haven't seen that much improvement in representation. So are there better ways that we can use community-based approaches to ensure that we are attracting, recruiting, retaining the potential individuals who want to become physicians and who will better mirror our populations on a more community-based level.
So this is just to briefly go back over one of the major inflection points in the last 10 years, realizing that this kind of cascade of events occurred between 2014 to 2021. Initially, students for fair admissions, they file these lawsuits almost in succession. And its goal is to pretty much show that there is discrimination against white and Asian students, while certain lawsuits from Harvard demonstrated specifically discrimination against Asian applicants. This escalated to the Justice Department, eventually cascading again into the territory of the Supreme Court. We get a 6-3 vote in 2023 that pretty much shook a lot of practices. Now, if you were in California, this is like something that we had been seeing earlier and expected. But ultimately, the fact that this ruling occurred and the composition of the Supreme Court at this time reflecting prior decisions, this set off a cascade, or rather was a windfall event. And there's some language that we should pay attention to in the actual writing. Specifically, this concept that a student must be treated based on his or her experiences as an individual, not on one race or one particular basis of race. They also stated that it is difficult to determine if goals of training future leaders in the public and private sectors and promoting the robust exchange of ideas is sufficiently met. I do want to point out, though, that if you do get a chance to read it, there's some other pieces in this. And again, for the sake of time, I think this is important to elevate the fact that race, for the first time, was being viewed as not, it could not be perceived as a negative thing. It couldn't be used as a detractor. As a result of this, we start to see the subsequent years and admission cycles shift significantly. Some of the immediate changes that we noticed were that programs started to change the language that they used. And there was different types of signaling tactics to draw the interest of URIM applicants. And then some programs became at jeopardy, followed by initial trends in admission cycles. Just want to show you all this particular graph here. There's a variety of different institutions that demonstrated either no net real change or subtle changes in either their subpopulations of Black or Hispanic enrollment. And the more concerning were the fact that this was an early trend and it could potentially indicate long-term effects. When we get into medical school specifically, this is data from the AAMC. It showed that there was, again, this dramatic, well, not dramatic, but a shift in applicant numbers and who was actually being accepted. The matriculants changed. But we don't see really a change in population's desire, meaning the desire to still be among individuals in a medical school is growing. So I think that that's an important trend to notice. But for majority applicants, they didn't really see a net change, if not a slight increase. Long-term considerations, things that we have to think about is that this now creates legal precedents, right? It's a fulcrum for anti-DEI discussions. It also creates the entry point for defunding these efforts. We also worry about the optics, like this idea that in learning environments are no longer or less inclusive than they were previously. It also de-emphasizes some of the social and the structural factors that affect both our outcomes within this workforce, but also patient outcomes. And URM applicants are starting to take note of this as well. There may be some uncertainty, but you ultimately see this type of pivoting where they are folding into institutions that are open to their presence. They pivot away from institutions that are majority and that lack URM leadership or presence of URM faculty members. And there's also this idea that we have to do it ourselves, kind of growing within this particular affected group. And so I'd expect this trend to continue until there's additional policy change.
Thank you, sir. Make it the microphone. Let me make sure I know how to use this. So just a quick poll. How many of us right now live in a state where there's been a DEI ban? So I'm speaking. Your mic's not working. Oh, it's not. All right. What did I do? Hello there. I feel like I'm loud enough sometimes that I don't need it, but we do need to record it. So I'm speaking a little bit to the choir, and this is rapidly changing. We've given this lecture on different occasions, and I feel like every time we give the lecture, I have to update this this map. This is as of April when the deadline was due for this. I'm sure it's changed a little bit since then. But there's been 127 of these bills. As soon as the SCOTUS repeal occurred, there was 127 just introduced. 17 had final legislative approvals. 16 became into law. And the only bright side of all of this is that 73 had been tabled or failed to pass or were vetoed. Many of these states, one of which I live in, is Texas. Texas has one, Florida has two, North Dakota, South Dakota, Utah, Alabama, Idaho, West Virginia, North Carolina, so I saw some of the, and then Iowa. And Iowa was supposed to be the most restrictive of all of them. So what exactly, so we're gonna do a general view of what these bills are, and then we're gonna do a case study of one of the states where the bill was introduced. So overall, some of the goals are: one, no influence of sex, race, gender, sexual orientation in hiring decisions. No preferential treatment given based on the above for grants, scholarships, or financial aid. No political tests or diversity statements. No teaching or counseling based upon DEI principles. And no funding for DEI offices or leadership. So let's talk about Texas. So this came very, very quickly. As soon as the SCOTUS repeal, there was already word that they were working on this. And it came, SB 17, the law was passed in February 2023. They gave us a little bit of time in order to get our acts together. So it went into effect January 2024. And overall, the goals were this: prohibiting any public colleges or universities in Texas from establishing or maintaining DEI office or initiatives. Now, I'm at UT Southwestern. I also work at Parkland. Parkland's the county hospital. UT Southwestern is the university. So it was kind of interesting because even though Parkland was not sponsored by the state, there was a lot of compliance that occurred in one versus in both of them. Even though it wasn't necessarily involved in. And that was kind of the overall goal of this. So it banned DEI, LGBTQI offices, positions, and programs, banned any solicitation of DEI statements, any mandatory diversity training for students and employees. Unfortunately, people have seen it as any diversity trainings. But it's, as long as it's not mandatory, it was okay. Preference of race, sex, ethnicity, or national origin in hiring or admissions. And then the big one was adoption of these policies to discipline people who violate the law. There's actually websites that have come up. They've actually, we had, I don't want to talk about it. But there's websites that have come up where they're actually calling out people. And anytime there's been a name change or anything, they actually call them out and then try to pressure their state senators and whatever to go after those people. And then there's a yearly certification of compliance for it. What it does not ban: academic course instruction. So we can always invite people to come speak. It does not ban scholarly activity by faculty or students. It does not ban activities by recognized student organizations, guest speakers of performance, or student recruitment. So you can still go recruit, you can still go to SNMA, you can go to LMSA to recruit people. Now the effects are very, very paramount. So one, within the next day, they have fired staff from UT Austin. Various universities had to close down their diversity offices. And one of the big things it did was, because we had they had multicultural centers that were involved in new student admissions, Black graduation, various graduations, and trying to bring community for various groups. Those ended, and therefore the student groups now had to be involved in planning of these events. As you can imagine, we're going to school. School is hard enough. And now you got to be involved in planning these things and getting funding for these things. So this is, if there's anything minority tax, this is minority tax on steroids, where now you're involved in doing all those things while also trying to focus on doing very well in school and whatnot. And so the effects have been, they've been very, very pretty bad so far. But we have hope, and we're going to keep fighting. And so I'm going to transfer now to Valerie to talk a little bit about the response to DI plans.
Okay, so we're going to kind of talk about what has happened in light of the Texas case study. So we've seen, obviously, since then, since 2024, many different universities at different states across the nation have had to either rename or rebrand their departments. These are things that we're also seeing right now within our own universities, right? There's also been a loss or reassignment of jobs, elimination of DEI training for admissions and employment, and elimination of funding for DEI activities. So as we said, this is not just happening at the university level with college and undergraduate students, but we're seeing this now in our School of Medicines as well. And there have been, as we talked about, a lot of effects that we're seeing in terms of decline of students of color or different URIM definitions actually matriculating into medical school. And this kind of will then obviously happen into emergency medicine residency, right? So these are just some of the things that have been happening. Also, I didn't mention it on here, but silence. A lot of universities, depending upon what state you're practicing in, have kind of been radio silent because they're not sure what to say. In my state, our attorney general is leading different activities to, sue the government for what's going on, and other states have joined. But this is still very in the early stages, so we don't know what the long-term ramifications of that will be. But in response to that, some universities don't know how to respond. And so they've been silent across the universities as well as our departments as well. So a lot still remains to be seen as to how this is going to move forward and play out. Okay, so other ways School of Medicines are responding in a way to still try to encourage diversity within their missions is holistic review. The AAMC has actually been talking about this for more than 15 years. What holistic review is, if you guys don't know, is it's the consideration of taking the whole applicant's portfolio into consideration for admissions. So kind of de-emphasizing that whole thing about just test scores and GPA. So what they're doing is trying to look at people's background. So if someone says, I come from a first generation American family, or considering people who grew up in rural America, if they're the first person in their family to attempt to even go to college, the first one to graduate high school, things like that. Also looking into someone's economic background in their childhood. So if their parents both were farmers and did not make much money, if they really emphasize that in their personal statement, putting a higher quota or percentage or points for the application for things like that. And really placing more of an emphasis on personal statements. Like I said, de-emphasizing what we always use as those metrics of GPA and test scores, okay? And then also local outreach. Now more than ever, this has become really important. So those local pipeline programs that universities typically use and School of Medicines use to engage the local population, which tends to be very different from the physician population that practices in that area, creating programs where they'll go into the community and emphasize that, you too can become a physician if that's something important to you, or just programs involved in STEM. So emergency medicine department's response to DEI bans. So as we know, and Dr. Manny just said that this is happening across the nation right now more than ever. One of the biggest things that we've seen just in talking amongst ourselves and talking to our friends at other institutions, sounds like one of the biggest things is silence. So a lot of departments are discussing with legal at their own institutions who are aware of the state laws, what can we do? What can we not do? One thing that I've seen is that if you look in the past 2 months, a lot of universities that had DEI websites have been removed, right? Another thing that's been happening is that in terms of having that Office of DEI, they're now rebranding or changing the name. So community engagement, advancement for others, or different things, ABC, inclusion, belonging, inclusivity, cultural improvement, whatever you can use to not say DEI. Disclaimer, we'll have a talk about that later on this week. But basically, the thought of it is there's some groups that are going around doxing different EM departments and physicians that if they see the words DEI, that makes you more noticeable and puts you under pressure and under light. So in order to kind of avoid that, a lot of departments are removing those websites. They're asking for changing in the names as soon as possible. They're asking their physicians and faculty and students to kind of be a little bit more silent about different acts or different protests in terms of what's happening across the nation. And a lot of this is, to be honest, we're just all trying to figure it out. No, I think there's no like perfect answer to what's going on. But what we're gonna do now is I think we have quite a bit of time, about 15 minutes to kind of talk amongst our neighbors, or we can have an open forum now, if you feel comfortable, talking about how have these laws impacted you where you work and in your community. And we all know that necessarily where we practice is not where we're from or things like that, but what is your institution doing if you feel comfortable to speak up about what's going on, and if we can collaborate some communication and hopefully figure out some ways to things we can bring back to our institutions to kind of still work on promoting DEI and diversity and inclusion in our departments without necessarily going against some of these bans or laws that are affecting us right now. I don't know if people have microphones. I don't think so, but I'm happy to bring it to you all. This one, okay. Does anyone feel comfortable? And you don't have to identify your institution. I know this is recorded. You do not need to identify yourself. You just want to talk about what's happening at your institutions. You do not need to identify yourself.
We can also not record this part of the conversation if that would allow for a better discussion potentially. I mean,
I'll defer to Shereen and Adam on that.
I can ask them.
Hi guys, my name is Marshall Leonard. I identify Stony Brook Medicine on Long Island, New York. I'm a director of the DI office that we just initiated, but it's actually now called Health Equity and Advocacy, strategically sort of named in a sense. However, we just received we have a new chair in our emergency department has not changed a lot of things, but came with a lot of energy. And one of the main things that he wanted to continue to improve and develop is this office. We had a lengthy conversation in regards to why the name was actually changed. There wasn't any sort of pressure to change it, but he wanted to make sure that it still had the same effects, and all the things that we wanted to kind of continue with the office was there. However, our School of Medicine has changed the name to, I don't even know exactly what it is, but it doesn't actually have the actual impact of what the office or whatever, and the person that's actually going to be running that hasn't been elected yet or hired yet. So that's still playing out in our office. Our hospital and our state sort of has a lot of encouragement and continue to have support. However, I'm seeing whether or not that support is really concrete or it's just a little bit more just talk instead of the actual action. So throughout this year, it's going to be interesting to see what kind of obstacles we sort of face going forward.
I just wanted to chime in and highlight what you just said, that there's this dichotomy between what a lot of the school of medicines are doing and the departments of emergency medicine, which is making it a little bit harder, I think, for some of us trying to figure out how do we navigate these times right now.
So I'm in Ohio, which, Senate Bill 1, I think, probably gives Iowa a run for its money in terms of sort of severity of impact. But, and they've made it clear that name changes and things like that, they're not gonna sort of allow those things. And so, we have had, messaging about kind of local commitment to the work, and that our goals of the department and division are unchanged. So, some of the things that we've been able to do, we have a pretty robust book club that we've run for a long time, and we've brought in sort of some of the things that we're looking at to include some mental health books and some other things that maybe weren't something that we were reading in that space before, that makes it a little bit less of a kind of an easy mark, and still encourages people to be learning about things that are impacting our patients and really sort of benefit the community as a whole. And then for our Women in Emergency Medicine group, which has a published curriculum and is an evidence-based like professional development course, doing some summaries and some we've talked about kind of some quarterly meetings that are not only open to female identifying people, so that we are not at as much risk of someone saying that this group doesn't welcome everyone and has to go away.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. So I am in a blue state in contrast to what she just mentioned. But it's a little bit interesting how this has impacted our institution because a week after the inauguration, the School of Medicine, specifically the Office of Admissions, received inquiries into their practices based on that Supreme Court decision. Fox News basically went after a handful of specific medical schools, and we were one of them. And so as a response to that, our institution, as Valerie was saying, started taking things down. Timing, of course, is very convenient in this particular situation for those groups. And the, I guess, tagline that they're using is that the institution's core values maintain the same, which do include equity, diversity, and inclusion. Our School of Medicine has renamed their office to Health Strategies and Engagement. Interestingly enough, the overarching university has not yet renamed their their committee despite this. And then from our departmental standpoint, every department is doing something a little bit different, and we as a emergency medicine have been working on figuring out how do we best communicate what we want to do and have the name be effective in doing that while still aligning with what the institution expects.
Hi, everyone. Manny Montano. So I'm also coming from a blue state. I'm coming from Colorado, and it's been a challenge, as I'm sure everyone here is very, very intimately aware. Similarly, I think there have been numerous institutions and states that have been viewed as sanctuary locations that have been gone after, including in my state. And what we have tried to balance is an approach between anticipatory adjustments and being cautious not to relinquish and cede power unnecessarily. And so we've been trying to stay on top of a few things. There were a couple of name changes that we had as well. So our vice chancellor changed the office to access and engagement to kind of preemptively get on top of this. This was actually even before the SCOTUS ruling was coming down, kind of seeing what was in the water. But then since then, we've been very careful not to make any reactionary changes without direction and instruction, maybe guardrails from our hospital leadership, our GME leadership. And I think that's been a valuable tool, and legal. It's been valuable in all of our conversations with our regulatory stakeholders is don't make any changes until we've evaluated what's going on, and then we can set some guardrails, if you will, or criteria with which you have to meet, and then you operate and do your thing. And that's been a good way for us to balance not making changes reactionary, that are too reactive, yet still trying to stay on top of the changing situation.
I just want to highlight one of the things that you said that I think is super helpful. A lot of, I would say in multiple institutions, at faculty meetings, they're starting to introduce like a compliance officer or have conversation with their legal about this directly. And that gives line of sight as far as like what are the phrases and the words that could potentially be flagged and make the institution, I mean, the program more vulnerable, and then also seeing student groups do the same thing at the level of medical schools. So that's one strategy that I think has been super helpful.
And it's also difficult because there's still websites that are going after people, and you see them put things like before and after. So they look at somebody's role, director of diversity, equity, inclusion, and they look after and director of office of engagement or whatever, and then they still send the thing saying, hey, the role hasn't changed. They just changed the name. They think we're stupid. And so they're going after these people. And so it becomes very, very difficult in order to do what you're trying to do if you're changing the name but still trying to accomplish the same thing. So it's been a struggle. The other thing is, you know, the over compliance. I think some of these rules are general on purpose, right? In order to cause people to be over compliant, so that now you're scared to even have people come teach, even though that's not banned. You're scared to have people have lectures. You know, I remember at one point they wanted to have a lecture for faculty at an institution, and they had to get permission from like all the way at the top, because you're like scared to do a lecture, even though as long as it's not mandatory and people can opt out, it's fine. But this over compliance, we're seeing so many of them, and this overall theme of fear, right? Fear of retribution, fear, because one of the things is if there's no compliance, they're entitled to terminate contracts and whatever. And I think it's been really tough. So I'm really excited to hear more and more strategies that one can do in order to combat this, because it's definitely taken a toll.
I also just want to check in and see how people are feeling. So I know I personally am angry. I'm very angry right now. So literally just yesterday, I run the Healthcare Disparities in Emergency Medicine clerkship. It's an away rotation for fourth-year students. And literally just yesterday, I got a random email from somebody I've never met, I don't know who they are, saying, yeah, we need to take out the word disparities. Disparities. Are you serious? Like, that is what we do. That is emergency medicine. I was like, what do you want me to change it to? What are the issues with the word disparities? Give me a whole list of words that I cannot use. It couldn't be produced. They were like, well, you can go with community engagement. That's not what the course is on. You can go with social impact. That's not what the course is on. And so I know I personally am just angry and I'm processing that. So I just want to see how other people are feeling, because I think we have a lot of like-minded individuals here. We have a lot of leaders in this space here. And just, has anybody had any like coping skills? I love that we talked about Journal Club focused on mental health. I think that's something that's actually going to be really important. So I'm going to implement that. What other strategies and what other feelings do people have?
I certainly have been impacted. Like the cognitive load of the last 100 and whatever days has been immense. And I think sharing that with your leaders and letting them know, like, they're like, hey, what's going on? And you're like, are you watching the news at all? Because you're trying to get me to do something nice, and I'm trying to figure out whether I can be in this country safely or not. And so, you know, I think at the end of the day, foreshadowing to the next talks, we'll be talking about some of the things we're doing. But I think I've done about 70 hours of DEI training the last month, so it's still happening where I'm at. And one of the words that I've come up with that I think says a lot of what I'm feeling, or that cuts to the chase but isn't banned yet, is dehumanizing. You know, instead of saying, I think that's bias, or I think, you know, whatever it may be, it'd be like, I think you're dehumanizing that person. And I think it cuts the same way, but is less activating in some ways. And so that's one of the words that I've been using a bit more. Because I think at the end of the day, instead of having to navigate people's feelings on, you just called me bias and I want to be seen as good, it really just goes to like, okay, like, let's talk about how this has dehumanized this person, and let's figure out a way how we can move around that. Like, I don't think any of us want to dehumanize anyone. I mean, there are some people at the highest levels of our country who want to dehumanize many people in this room. But those aren't our target audience. And those are not people who are ever going to change or get to do things differently. But in terms of our colleagues and those who may have some strong opinions about what we're doing, I think it cuts around some of the bullshit to just like, let's talk about what we're truly focused on. And that's about being more human to one another. And I'll be talking about restorative practices next, but I think that's language that does not use any of those banned words, but drives home a lot of the same points. I'd rather be direct about what we're doing because I think we can have more honest conversations. But at the end of the day, I want to make sure that our patients get better treatment, our learners have a better learning environment, that we treat each other better. And so if we have to like dance a different dance, then we'll do that until they also ban that.
I think that was a great point about feeling dehumanized. I know, many of myself and other faculty members have felt that way. I know, so I have a new role in the medical school, and unfortunately for several of the students who are graduating this year, they are not getting celebrated like years past. Previously, there were separate ceremonies and a dinner specifically for students who are underrepresented in medicine, really to highlight some of the additional struggles that they likely had in their pursuit of their medical education. However, those have been shut down. We had a recruitment event a few months ago. Again, that usually we have a large breakfast that is celebrated, bringing students of minority status into our offices so that they can meet deans of the medical school and other members in a more intimate setting. That had to be shut down as well. And so obviously, we are feeling dehumanized. Students are feeling dehumanized. I know that we have looked towards doing not really open forums, but more closed forums with some of the student groups so that they can express their feelings. But it is definitely a difficult time. So I really liked what you said.
Can you guys hear me?
Oh,
Yep.
all right, go ahead.
Thank you guys for sharing all your experiences and having this talk. I think aside from, I think everyone in this room is upset and frustrated on so many different levels. There's an air of almost hopelessness, especially on shift, because you want to do more, but you're just on this tightrope of what can I do, what can I say, what can I do? And I would be interested to know how you guys are approaching these conversations with our learners, with our residents and our med students and our sub-Is who have every right to ask us these questions and have every right to be upset on shift, because I find myself not knowing really what to say to them, aside from telling them that you can be upset, you can feel these feelings. I just don't have an answer for you of what the next step would be. And it's especially like I run a middle school pipeline program specifically for Black and Brown students. It's almost hypocritical for me to run these sessions and say, yes, come into medicine, when it's a field that almost does not value you and what you bring to the table. So I know we all work with learners at different stages. So if you have had these conversations, like how are you guys approaching them, especially for our outgoing fours or our seniors who will be practicing alone in this very volatile environment? What tips, what advice are you giving them to really learn how to be an attending at this level, but not just that, how to be a Black and Brown attendee in this world, because it's so different than it was a few months ago.
Can you hear me? Yeah. How you doing? So one of the things that I've been doing is emphasizing that there is community. Like a lot of times it feels as though this particular time is dismal and that they're alone. And so I'm like, no, there's actually a very robust community. And I share widely what my experiences are like in community. I invite them. I'm like, hey, I'm going to this thing, or there's this talk, or there's this conference, and there's going to be a lot of people who are able to kind of support you and rally around you as you enter into this next phase of your learner journey. The other thing I do is I make sure that they understand that there's like good literature that supports the way that they feel, that they do belong, that there is true impact in terms of patient outcomes, and measurable, quantifiable financial impact about their presence. So there's always a North Star for them. Like, yeah, you know what? If you are in this space, this type of outcome can happen. And so we need you there, despite what all of the, I would say, other information and background noise is suggesting. And I think the last thing for me is that learner pipeline. Now, this is a little bit earlier, like, well, I would say earlier, like medical students all the way through. The medical students actually have significant amount of opportunity to discuss this. It hasn't really been significantly affected or attacked at that level. And so I encourage those conversations. I try to create, I would say, coalition work where multiple groups that would be affected are joining in on hosting these dialogues. And I serve as one of the liaisons for those conversations. And then make sure that faculty members are hearing those things and are taking note of it in their evaluation so that it can be woven into curriculum. So like those are ways that you can do this subtly that are not directly being attacked because it's still a part of the learner journey and it's content, not necessarily about a feeling or a belief at that point.
I know we're out of time. I think
Sorry.
Manny had one more comment.
Yeah, just to touch on that point, I think at the end of the day, the goal is to say that we can do something, right? Yes, it sounds hopeless, but it's a time to have advocacy, to join in groups and working together in order to make a difference. I think some of those points are going to be touched on in the next sessions. I feel like we're playing, in terms of the names, my comment before was about this, we're doing like institutional whack-a-mole where we went from, CRT to woke to DEI, and now they're chasing after disparities, which is something that people were talking about. So just never giving up and knowing that there's going to be a light at the end of the tunnel. And we have to just keep doing the work. And I'm really excited that many of us are here who are interested in doing the work, and I feel very encouraged by that. And I look forward to seeing the effects of the work that we're doing. So thank you so much for listening to us, and we look forward to all the other sessions and learning more from you all. Thank you.
We're going to jump into the lightning talks then next. We're going to start with Dr. McFarland and then kind of move.
It's going to be all the way at the bottom.
Yeah. There you go. Move this one. Let me do Adams first. Real quick.
It's all at the whole time.
Okay, so my short 10 to 15 minute presentation is on creating inclusive environments and promoting retention, which after following that talk, I think, recognizing that there are a lot of challenges there, this sort of talk could be a whole entire conference in itself. So what I try to do is sort of highlight a couple different strategies from kind of different levels in emergency departments and hospitals in order to spark some ideas, potential dialogue about ways that we can do that. I have no financial disclosures still. There you go. Okay, so basically by the end of the session, we want to understand some challenges to creating and maintaining inclusive environments, identify some strategies to promote retention of underrepresented residents and faculty, and identify high-quality resources that outline evidence-based practices for inclusion and retention. So with this audience, I don't think I need to tell anybody it's not new that, especially in our current political climate, creating and maintaining inclusive environments is extremely challenging. We are just beginning to, in academic medicine, illuminate the experiences and understand those experiences that students and faculty from underrepresented backgrounds have, and really try to identify threats to those things, right? And then come up with evidence-based practices for overcoming those. In order to have all of those people thrive in our departments, right, it's not just about having that initial sort of spark, that initial plant, but how are we, to lean really hard into the plant analogy here, how are we cultivating that soil to make it a place where not only do people want to start their growth, but continue, develop, and then eventually thrive? So the framework that we're going to sort of utilize to talk about this topic is sort of addressing individual level challenges, department level factors, and institutional level efforts to create that inclusive environment and promote retention. So when we talk about individual level challenges, there's kind of two different prongs to this. So one is understanding the challenges that physicians from underrepresented backgrounds experience. And then the other part of individual level challenges is understanding the ways in which we are biased, in which we are performative allies, in which ways that we actually provide those threats to those learners ourselves, and sort of a self-reflection to understand how we can promote inclusivity. So this is one of the earlier sort of qualitative studies that was done. This is from 2018, where this group of authors did a qualitative analysis of Black residents, and they just kind of asked, like, what is your experience in medicine, right? And this really, I think, sparked a whole sort of branch of research that really used qualitative analysis to understand those experiences. And some of the great quotes are here. Again, I think for people from underrepresented backgrounds, these thoughts aren't necessarily new, but we're putting it down in evidence, and we're making it more accessible to a broader audience to understand what our colleagues experience. So things like, there was an African-American resident a year before me who would constantly get confused. Even now, we don't look anything alike. Somebody thinking that they were transport, right? Going over to like even the coping mechanism, saying, I laughed it off, I smiled it off, right? But those are things that still affected me as a learner. And are problematic for maintaining that inclusivity and maintaining that rich environment for these residents to grow. So we have to understand the individual level factors that our colleagues experience, right? So understanding just straight up, how does racism play a role in the ability of our colleagues to grow and thrive, right? We know that the structures and the people that provide racist aggression toward our students affect their mental health. We know there's higher rates of depression and suicide with physicians from underrepresented backgrounds, right? We understand that microaggressions happen every single day, death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? And how those things, not only do we have had to understand in our departments where those happen, but how we can be upstanders and respond to them. Understanding the idea of performative allyship, right? So, are you being a true ally if you, as a residency program director, send out an email to your residents during Women's History Month and say, we support all our female residents, way to go, but then aren't following through necessarily with, having lactation rooms and sort of making accommodations for pregnancy, right? Having a diversity mission statement on your website, but then not following that up with actual initiatives and evidence-based practices, right? So that's a sort of a self-reflection that we need to do on the individual end to make sure that we are actually being active allies in that relationship. Additionally, understanding some of those theories that have been identified from the literature that are specific to our underrepresented learners and colleagues. So homophily, which is the feeling that groups tend to associate with similar people, right? If you have one Black resident in your program, that can be a threat to them forming that community, from finding mentors, and sort of affect their ability to develop those mentorships to advance their career, to really bond with their colleagues. Understanding stereotype threat, right? Where someone feels like, I can't make a mistake because that means that they're going to think that all residents that share my social identity are also making mistakes and are also not good doctors. And that can have a lot of cognitive load on those individual learners and really impede their ability to grow and develop. And then the understanding of imposter syndrome, saying like, oh man, am I only here because I'm of this particular identity? And they're discounting the amazing things that they've done, the awesome physicians that they are to get to the spot and maintain their status. So we have to understand these things, right, to understand how to overcome those barriers for our learners and our colleagues. Additionally, sort of the next tier is looking at department level factors, right? And so in getting into this, we're thinking about department administrators, we're thinking about faculty, right? So more than just sort of on that individual level. First and foremost, thinking about intentional education, right? So this is sort of using and utilizing a needs assessment in our departments to understand what are the needs that our department has to create those inclusive environments, and what are some of the threats. This is going to look similarly or in some ways and different in others. I would bet that probably every department could use training on microaggressions and upstander interventions, right? Like no matter how much of that stuff department has done, that's always a topic that can be utilized. But maybe your department needs some specific education when it comes to, you know, pronouns and how do I talk to or speak about a non-binary resident, right? If you never had that before, right? So understanding what your department's needs are in terms of the educational needs and the interventions that need to happen to create that inclusive environment. In particular, looking at equitable evaluations. There's been evidence that has shown that for SLOEs, for emergency medicine, there are disparities in the word choices that are used in the scores for URIMs, for gender. There was a great study that was published recently where they looked at ACGME milestones for internal medicine residencies, and they found consistently that across these 6 different residency programs, underrepresented racial groups had lower scores, Asian Americans had lower scores, and women had lower scores compared to their white male peers, right? And I think there's a lot that we can do in terms of equity and evaluation, right? It's looking at the quality of the assessment and sort of how we are evaluating residents and how we're doing bias training there. So things like, you know, looking at what word choices are we using when we write our SLOE? Is there evidence to support what we're doing? Is our evaluation not specific and non-actionable? So instead of saying, you know, to this resident, oh, they really have a hard time forming patient rapport with patients. What does it actually mean in terms of the skills and the ACGME milestones? Is it that they're interrupting somebody every 5 minutes when they're giving a history? Because that's intervenable and that's actionable and that's less sort of biased language because you're identifying a particular skill. Are we using personality-based characteristics in our evaluations, right? That person's quiet. Well, okay, what does that mean, right? Is that they're quiet and they can't lead a resuscitation effectively, right? Or is that just their personality because of who they are, right? Getting more actionable, getting more specific. And then limited diversity in evaluators. If you have the same group of people that are evaluating your residents, that same subconscious bias is going to continue to come out for that same group of people, right? So I would encourage everybody, if you're involved in assessment, either residents, medical students, or faculty, to have a program of evaluation of your assessment. So looking at CCC, your written evaluations, your on-shift feedback, right? And are you focusing on milestones and competencies? Are you diversifying your evaluator pool? And are you having bias identification and training for those people to make sure that those things aren't happening to achieve equity in evaluation? That's a particular area of interest of mine, so I just wanted to highlight that a little bit. Additionally, on departmental level factors, so mentorship, right? So we know mentorship is incredibly important for residents and faculty in terms of identifying career interests and promoting them getting into those careers, right? So are the factors that we talked about on the individual level affecting your ability to provide strong mentorship, right? Taking a look at your program and saying, how am I connecting those residents? How am I developing those relationships? How are we connecting faculty together? And are we doing it in a way that promotes inclusion and equity? Using equitable recruitment strategies, both in residency and faculty recruitment, which we'll be talking about later, but things like holistic reviews, you know, potentially standardized questions to decrease bias. Minimizing the minority tax, right? And I think this has actually gotten a lot more challenging in the past couple months because we've had to eliminate positions and change things around, right? But our faculty actually getting representation and getting buy down and getting what they need so that their work in DEI is not necessarily coming at the expense of their own time, their own mental health, and their own money. And faculty recruitment. So there's a good article from 2022, which some of the people in this room are the authors on this one, and this is a court article, that gave best practices for faculty recruitment and retention in particular. And that's some of the things we talked about. Establishing a culture of inclusivity, you know, avoiding overusing UI in faculty with that minority tax, making sure that UI and faculty are promoted appropriately and evaluate for biases in the promotion and tenure process, right? So this is a good article to take a look at, to go back to your departmental processes and be like, are we following these recommendations, or are we sort of out of compliance with some of these things? So all of the topics, both on the individual level and the department level, I think are really important things that when we talk about that intentional education piece, to make sure are coming up in the curriculum for your faculty or residents. And I think you can get really creative. So right now, we're kind of looking at this a lot in our department on ways that we can sort of take these strategies and incorporate them into educational structures that already exist, whether that's at faculty meetings, We just had our educator retreat where I did an upstander training, and a lot of our faculty had never heard that term before, so that was really helpful. An ongoing faculty education series. This is something that we're starting in July. We do M&M, the first conference of every month for 2 hours, and that's our highest attended faculty event during conference. We're going to tack on half an hour after M&M when the faculty are still there for specific education topics. And those aren't all DEI topics, but DEI will be incorporated there, and we're getting CME for that as well to sort of get faculty to be incentivized to show up to those things. Journal Club was mentioned earlier. I think it's a great talk, a great time to identify some of these articles and talk about some of the topics that we mentioned. And then, of course, conference time or SIM. There's a lot of ways to get creative about the education piece of this, but it's got to happen if we're going to really promote that culture of inclusivity and equity. Okay, and lastly, navigating institutional level efforts. So, as a junior faculty member, some of this stuff is a little bit beyond me, but we all have the power to sort of push our ACGME in our hospitals to push for some of these things. So really importantly, establishing mental health resources. So does the insurance that the residents have cover mental health, right? Are those mental health providers sharing the identity characteristics of your residents so they have somebody that they can turn to? I can tell you, our residents, this has been a change in the last 5 years, and our residents find it incredibly helpful that they can actually find a therapist that's covered by insurance and doesn't break the bank. Looking at peer community mentoring initiatives, so those like ACGME hospital-wide, affinity groups, which again has been a little bit more challenging recently, but people have found a way to get around them, right? So connecting people together that's just not in their residency program and forming another layer of community that's hospital-wide. Looking at your faculty promotion criteria, like we mentioned in that article, right? There's opportunities for bias in there. Is the work that people are doing represented in those criteria? Of course, funding is always a big one, right? So funding for, DEI initiatives and those affinity groups. Community initiatives, right? So using your institution and your department to develop those community sponsorships, getting out and sort of volunteering at those events that are related to DEI to promote that culture of inclusivity. And then, of course, compliance with executive orders and laws, which is an ongoing issue, right? And sort of an ongoing conversation to have at the institutional level about how we're going to continue to advocate and do this work, despite some of the challenges that have come up. So I just want to highlight this particular resource. This is the ADIEM Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Curriculum. If you're not familiar with it, this has been in development over the past couple of years. It's on the SAEM website. And a lot of the topics that I have talked about today are in this resource. And essentially what it is, it's a list of sort of resources and lesson plans so that you don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. So you can go to this website, they've got, information on microaggressions, they highlight the literature, they talk about the problems, they have suggested ways to present this topic in 10 minutes and 30 minutes. So it's a great starting point that if you are trying to develop some education or some self-learning, starting with this particular curriculum, so you don't necessarily, again, have to reinvent the wheel, right? And you can get some direction for these sort of educational interventions. And then these are the resources I had with a lot of the articles that I cited today and some of the evidence. Like I said, I think what's been awesome is in the last 10 years, I think there's been a lot of evidence that has come out for identifying some of these topics that we've talked about, but also identifying best practices as best evidence support that they could be. So that was quick, but thanks very much.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Much of what we're going to cover when we're talking about strategies for recruitment and retention are going to be things that are familiar to everyone. So we will try our best to breeze through these slides, and we'll introduce ourselves as each of us comes up. But I'm Kamna Balhar. I'm at Hopkins. No disclosures. And we're going to be talking about evidence-based practices that can be applied towards recruiting faculty and residents who are underrepresented in medicine, with a focus on outreach as well as selection strategies, and then identify some issues around retention and kind of going beyond retention towards inclusion and flourishing. So just very briefly, what do we mean by URIM? I think we all know what this term indicates, and the AAMC's definition falls heavily along racial and ethnic lines. But when we say URIM, I want us to sort of be thinking about this broadly, not just in terms of minoritized racial and ethnic groups, but also gender identities, LGBTQIA plus individuals, those from different socioeconomic strata, people who are first-gen graduates. This field is really broad, and we're hopeful that much of what we talk about is broadly applicable to those who are underrepresented. So we'll start from the beginning, from recruitment. The first step really is setting the stage and outlining what it is that you mean to accomplish. And it's not just identifying your intention to create a representative residency program or faculty workforce, but it's publicly stating it. And obviously we will get into the trickiness around that now. But the ACGME indicates that the program's mission should drive recruitment of a diverse and inclusive workforce. And the mission should also determine who's in charge. And best practices in holistic review also state that the process needs to be mission-driven. Do mission statements even matter? Does anyone look at them? What happens after you read them? The evidence actually, perhaps surprisingly, suggests that yes, they do matter. Studies show, for instance, that schools with a higher degree of social mission are more likely to produce more family physicians and physicians who ultimately went on to provide care to underserved populations. Schools that explicitly state a mission to address representation in medicine graduated more physicians who were underrepresented in medicine over a 4-year period as compared to schools that did not in one study. And broadly from the workforce, evidence from hospital-based organizational literature suggests that when employees are on the same page as the hospital mission, they do better. This review from Academic Medicine from 2019 is obviously outdated now, given the climate that we're in. But they make some sort of excellent generalized statements that I think are still applicable at this time. So they mention avoiding anything that's declarative, like we don't discriminate, and instead being aspirational, instead of sort of implying that we've already accomplished everything, so what's the point, right? And implying that we've already hit our goals, which I don't think any of us truly have. So ensuring that it's aspirational, and in cases where there's little faculty diversity, one of the core work groups recommends expressing that you're actively recruiting for diversity. Now, the reality is that many of the words that we would like to use to capture our commitment towards generating a clinically excellent, diverse, and inclusive workforce, many of those words are obviously under attack under the current administration, and depending on the institutional climate, federal policies, or state-level regulations, some words are going to be off limits. The list of off-limit words is long and will probably, unfortunately, continue to grow. But here's a list of some of the words that are being targeted, including the very basics like diversity and equity. So there is really no substitute for consulting with the legal forces that be at your program and institution. But perhaps there are ways to communicate what we mean without explicitly using the verbiage that is being discouraged. Again, we're not lawyers, but some of the ideas that could be applied towards communicating the message that truly represents our intentions would be, ideas around reflecting the population we serve. Consider the pathway taken, mission-driven, what are your values, welcoming a breadth of perspectives and experiences, humility, lived experience. I think social mission is still acceptable for us to say. And so Logan actually plugged this into ChatGPT and said, give me a mission statement that emphasizes diversity without using any of these words. And it's apparently possible. I will say there's like a little bit of a word salad aspect to it. However, I think I have a feeling that mission statements are going to evolve into sort of signals and ways of saying what we mean without explicitly saying it. And I strongly believe that applicants or future faculty are probably going to be looking for this intentional effort to communicate opportunities for inclusion, a commitment to diversity without saying those things. So it is very possible, I think, to tweak your mission statement to say what you mean without actually saying it, which is, it's really unfortunate that that's where we are, but that's where we are. And I will turn it over to Logan.
Thanks, Kamina. Hello, everyone. Logan Plant, also at Hopkins. I'm going to take a few minutes to sort of run through some strategies for recruiting in an inclusive way. My understanding is that we have an audience that probably understands that a lot of it understands and has already implemented a lot of these strategies, but we sort of collected the best evidence from literature and hope that there might be one or two things along the way that you'll pick up that you might be able to implement at your own program. So sort of before even setting out on the recruitment process, one of the things to do is consider your stakeholders. And I think a lot of times we think about sort of faculty, residents, et cetera, but considering like who are those folks that really have an invested, who are invested in your program and making sure that your residents are successful. So that may well include residents, your techs, nursing, even your administrators, and really thinking about who those folks that you want at the table to be before the process starts will help you to be successful. It's already been mentioned, there is a lot of bias training out there. This is certainly not a bias training, but it's important to be aware that bias is there and be intentional in your efforts to mitigate potential sources of bias. You're here, and I assume that you therefore are aware of bias and are motivated to mitigate it. And then in the next few slides, we're going to talk about a few strategies for mitigating bias in your recruitment. I think probably many of you know the police chief study, but it is a really cool study, and I want to just briefly go through it. So the researcher Ullman, a social psychologist, essentially set up an experiment where they were hiring for the traditionally male job of police chief. And what they did was they essentially set up two applications, and one of the applications was an applicant who had street smarts. So they were streetwise, they were able to move around and understand the city. And then there was another applicant, and this person was essentially book smart. They had studied the law, they knew what they were doing. And then what they did is for these two applications, then they said, well, we're gonna have Michael Smith and Michelle Johnson, and tell us who you wanna hire. And I think they took a group of undergrads and said, who do we want to hire as police chief? And what they found was essentially the vast majority of folks tended to hire the males into the job of police chief. But because the applications had been randomized, the people actually justified who they hired. So they said, oh, we actually picked this candidate because they had street smarts, because the male candidate had street smarts. Or vice versa, they picked the male candidate with book smarts because obviously book smarts are more important. But then essentially they took a different group, asked them to say, hey, what's important for police chiefs? They described the characteristics that they thought were important for police chiefs. And then they went back and they said, hey, now, who would you like to be the next police chief? And the gender bias went away because they had predefined what they wanted. They had predefined the idea of merit before meeting the group of candidates. So this is like a really cool paper that illustrates a really important thing, which is predefining those characteristics that you're seeking can help mitigate bias, but you have to be thoughtful about it and intentional. So each year with our faculty, we get together, we talk about what those characteristics are that we seek in our applicants, and then we use this sort of as a grounding exercise before starting our hiring process. And additionally, we make our standardized questions often based on those things that we have predefined that year. So ever so briefly, we're going to run through holistic application review. Holistic application review is really there not just to look at metrics or board scores or set cutoffs, but really to look at the whole individual. It is time intensive. It does take more effort, but it is very fruitful in the end for getting a group of residents or faculty who represent your mission and values. And so it's mission-based. It is diversity aware. As I mentioned, predefining merit comprehensively can help aid your holistic review, considering the distance traveled, and then really collecting data, following it over time, and being intentional throughout the process. So this is the ACGME model. You'll hear experiences, attributes, metrics, or experience, attributes, competencies, and metrics. And these are the various domains that you can consider as part of a holistic review. Traditional application review is often focused on that metrics piece, but we're trying to focus on the entire individual And by focusing on EAM or EACM, you can help mitigate some of the bias that's inherent in just looking at metrics and competencies. And it works. This is just a quick study from UT Houston. They showed that when they implemented holistic review, they had significantly increased number of folks they interviewed and ultimately hired from underrepresented groups. This is the algorithm they used, and part of the the attributes they felt were important to focus on were commitment to the underserved, leadership, language fluency, et cetera. And so this is one way in which you can do holistic review that's evidence-based. The Highland Group has done a ton and has published a ton on this. They were very successful in increasing their numbers of folks who are underrepresented in their ultimate resident and faculty group. Denver similarly has implemented holistic review. So there's a lot of evidence out there showing that this works if you're thoughtful. This is a recent paper that's been accepted and is not in final print form from Academic Medicine. But essentially what they did was they looked and they created a rubric for holistic review. They showed that it had a high degree of inter-rater reliability, and that they showed that the scores between UIM folks and non-UIM folks were similar across the board. What they don't show you in their tables is that it also, as they implemented their rubric, the number of underrepresented folks increased in both their top 10 and their final classes. So when we think about experience attributes, competencies, and metrics, this is the experience and attributes part of our spreadsheet that we use for evaluating applicants. I can't give you the points exactly, but we consider things like whether folks have faced adversity, the pathway they've taken, et cetera. And these are things that actually get considered when we're evaluating our applicants, and they go into the final score beyond just those simple board scores. This was just a quick mention that sometimes when reading an application, it's important that everybody is speaking the same language and understands the pathway traveled. And so there are many different pathway programs for folks who are underrepresented in medicine, and being familiar with what those are, what the acronyms are, can be helpful when you're evaluating an application. Consider removing potential sources of bias. This was a fairly unfortunate study, but it really showed that people are biased based on physical appearance. And so what we do is we actually remove the photos from our initial screening process. Also considering the halos and horns effect. So if you look at board scores first, that may color the evaluation of the rest of the entire file. And so one of the strategies that's suggested is the idea of horizontal versus vertical scoring, where instead of scoring an applicant, another applicant, and so on for 500, you're the person who scores the personal statements. And that can actually help mitigate bias when doing this. Remember, as Adam mentioned, the SLOs still contain a good degree of bias. Consider that when you're building your holistic review process. Personal statements can be a wealth of information in terms of distance traveled and the experiences and attributes, so make sure to pay attention to those. And then with that, I will turn it over to KB.
So we're going to speed through these so we get to Ernesto's slides, because they're going to be much more interesting than mine. But obviously we have increased attention towards our digital presence. So ensuring that what we're communicating in our digital spaces, which is what potential interviewers are seeing before they come to see us, is always important. Here's an example of sort of intentionally posting something that communicates core values about our program. So for us, this was staff inclusivity, teamwork dynamics, as well as sort of the interprofessional and personal diversity of the people represented. So we've talked about coming to the interview day. When you're setting up for the interview day, please, obviously being mindful of choosing who is interviewing and getting rid of people who are not on board with the program, and whether they reflect the diversity in the program that you are trying to build, and whether they accurately reflect the current diversity of the program as well. going back to the idea of predefining merit, hand in hand with that is the idea of standardized interview questions. And I know people find those super boring or super awkward sometimes, but we've been using them now for a few years at our program, and the feedback from the applicants has actually been surprisingly good. But this is an established best practice from the literature, not just in medicine, but from across corporate literature, to minimize bias in the hiring process. So these are behaviorally based questions that ask applicants to share actions or decisions that they've already made, that have already happened, as opposed to hypothetical future, like what would you do if, blah, blah, blah. And so these are actually more associated with predictors of future performance than those hypothetical questions. And so we actually base our standardized interview questions on those predefined merit characteristics that we talked about before. And having an anchor-based scale and training your interviewers to consistently ask the questions the same way is also really important. So just to give you an example, one of our predefined merit criteria was teachability. And so you see, tell me about a time that's already happened when you received tough feedback from a supervisor. And then we do have an anchor-based grading scale. And so we have an inadequate response, adequate, and best response. But we really want to, we value the responses where there's concrete evidence. Someone learned from that experience, so we come together and make these anchor-based scales for maximal reproducibility. We talked about not looking at folks' photos, but similarly, going into an interview with that previous file review is also an established best practice because pre-knowledge of what someone already looks like, of their demographics, of their experiences, can bias us. And so obviously, please let them know that this is their blinded interview and that it's not that you didn't take the time to read their application. And you can still use the standardized and scripted question even if it is an interview without preceding file review. Signals of inclusion, I think this kind of gets at a lot of what Adam has said already in terms of being mindful that your physical and your virtual spaces represent the values that are important to you. This is, we always love talking about this, but the idea of portraiture. We all have photos on the wall, right, in our departments, in our offices. Who is in the photos? There has already been data shown, data from medical students that shows that when they see certain kind of pictures on the wall, they feel like they don't belong. One of the quotes that one of the students said was, "I feel like if that person saw me walking these halls today, they would spit on me." So just being mindful about who's on the walls. Obviously, like don't put pictures of random people who don't represent your program, but really being mindful of who is celebrated, right? Because this is a space of, this is clearly signaling this is who we are. And so being mindful that you're balancing the history of your program or institution with the current reality. All right. Forward ahead, please.
For the sake of time, we're going to hop through some of these. So really, I want to talk about from the retention standpoint, initially about having two frameworks that really can sort of drive how you build the infrastructure that is necessary. So many of us have, you might be someone who's is looking to be successful at recruiting diverse members. You may have some initial success, or you may be a storied program that has had diversity for a long time. Wherever you're at, the landscape has changed, and so really creating infrastructure is important. So the first is cultural humility, and it's a lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and critique, to readdressing the power imbalances in the physician-patient dynamic, and to developing mutual benefit and non-paternalistic partnerships with communities on behalf of individuals and populations. And so this is what cultural humility really calls for us to do. I'm going to skip ahead and say, humility is a prerequisite in this process as the physician relinquishes the role of the expert to the patient, becoming the student of that patient with a conviction and explicit expression of that patient's potential to be capable and a full partner in their therapeutic alliance. So how does this work for us in the medical education, fostering this in our departments? Well, really, we're called initially as individuals to begin on our own journey, evaluating our own bias and evaluating how our program is serving or not serving these diverse individuals that we're trying to bring into our spaces. Similarly, you know, it's not a one and done. So this is something that should be iterative, probably yearly, but within that year, having times where you have meetings with your diverse members to see how things are going, where your blind spots have been. We certainly want folks to try to gain some cultural competency as well. You are called to, you know, go ahead and learn about the members of your community, the members, you know, what does your patient population look like? What are the diverse members that you've brought in? What is important to them? I loved Adam's point of, you know, if you have a binary trainee, you probably should stop and gain some understanding of what that means and teach individuals about that. In my institution, we have a number of levels that this is happening in terms of increasing our knowledge. We have an anti-racist curriculum. I'll give you the name change here in the next couple of months. So we know that, you know, old heads like some of us in the room did not get health equity and justice as part of our medical education. And so making sure that we teach that to all of our faculty and staff, because our undergraduate medical students are coming out of our pre-clinical years with like master's level understanding of these concepts. We also have departmental leaders that are bringing each department's sort of subtleties and nuances to the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion to help guide how we're rolling this out. And then we've also instituted a restorative practices community that is also looking to build this. And so we have multiple levels of scaffolding. Understand the power imbalance. Certainly, you know, it's one thing to say to your diverse members, "Hey, I really want to know what you're experiencing," but you have to build those relations, foster, and truly demonstrate that, and not just say it. Be member focused. Allow them to share with you what they want, what's important to them, and again, to say to them that, "Hey, I you know, especially for myself." I have experience as a, you know, cis Latino male, but I'm seek to gain understanding as much as possible, but I can't understand everything. I have blind spots and certainly have had those along the way. Before you make changes, get input before, during, and after, and empower diverse members to be leaders. When we created our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, we really sought to be as widely representative of our department as a whole. Staff was a huge blind spot. And a year into our committee, I don't think we're serving our staff still. And honestly, I don't know if our committee is the right committee to do that, because we have so much work to do that we truly probably need a separate staff committee. But those are, you know, trying to encourage members to speak up. And then being institutionally consistent. So how does your department manage the treatment of uninsured, undocumented, non-clinical staff? Does your department have a diverse faculty? Where's the buy-in for leadership? Shri, I know we're at time. Can we go about 5 more minutes? Okay. Next, I want to talk about restorative practices. This is a name change from restorative justice, and this was happening before all the words were attacked. The restorative justice comes a lot from the justice system, and really when it comes to what we're doing in medicine, it's more of practices. This is the Center for Restorative Justice definition from San Diego, and these practices are rooted in indigenous traditions. They've been used in the justice system and in K through 12 education for many years, and even some countries like Australia, Japan, and New Zealand have incorporated them. There's 4 tiers. The 0 tier, restorative mindset. This is newer in the literature, and this is really about doing that training. This directly ties into that cultural humility. Tier 1 is about community building, and this is where I would say we are primarily focusing our efforts on our campus. The second is responding to harm and conflict, and the third is reentry. And so what does it mean to have a restorative mindset? Well, on the individual level, this is about doing the work. Really working to value all individuals and perspectives, recognizing our interconnectedness, being collaborative in problem solving and having active accountability, And that conflict is only the tip of the iceberg. So those are opportunities for you to really engage your community and see what's actually going on below the surface. Tier 1, this is primarily done through learning circles, and similarly to cultural humility, gives our members of our community the opportunity to share what is important to them, what needs are not being met, and certainly is a time where harms may come up, but they are not necessarily like direct conflicts. That's tier 2 work. At our institution, we just put 30 plus individuals on our campus through a restorative justice training, and we said that we're not doing tier 2 work at this time. You really need institutional support. You really need to select correct situations. So you need both parties to want to engage, and certainly there are going to be circumstances that rise above the level of restorative practices that need your traditional ways of dealing with conflict and harm. Pre-conference, pre-conference, pre-conference. What does this mean? You really need to spend a lot of time getting the story from all sides. Understanding also the power dynamics. If your, conflict is between your, a professor in class and your students, there's going to be a ton of power dynamics. And so how that restorative circle looks may be different because of that. And then have a wide lens for who has been harmed, making sure that you incorporate as many voices into the discussion. Tier 3 is going to be reentry, and this is a great lens for thinking about, colleagues coming back or residents coming back from maternal leave, coming back from an illness, or at institutions where we have students who are leaving to do research or other training programs. How are you going to incorporate them back in? So why restorative practices? It's about trying to have a different input so we can have a different output. And so really rethinking what we're doing. And after the 3 days of training that we did, what I thought was, how can we be more thoughtful about how we approach things? All right, I'm gonna breeze through this. So this is a great article that really gives a great overview of how to incorporate restorative justice into medical education. And this is a great slide that kind of goes from that tier 0 all the way to tier 3. And we'll make our slides available for folks. I've seen a lot of pictures during so feel free to come and we'll give you those. And so in this article, they really make that equation of patient safety instead of not just being like, oh, you gave the wrong medication, you're a bad person. Really looking at what are the system ways that we're failing, and that's similar in just restorative practices. Always like to quote our colleagues. So as described by Boatwright and colleagues, restorative justice gives voice to those who are harmed, allows the perpetrator of the behavior to gain a greater understanding of the harm caused, and allows for community to come together, identify future steps for both victim and organization in pursuit of a more just community. Adam already shouted this article out. It's a small portion that's focused on retention, but a lot of high yield topics there. And then I'll point out this double AMC 4-step process for assessing your institution. So really, if you really want to be engaged in this, you have to be self-reflective as often as possible. And the last article I wanted to shout out was Advancing Diversity Through Inclusion. We're all here because of ADIM. And essentially, I want to call out to you all in the room, especially our junior faculty or students, to becoming involved. What this article really demonstrated is it's great to be a part of the society, but the more you delve in and allow yourself to be active in that community, you're likely going to have a lot of benefits to yourself. So leaders compared to non-leaders in this study were more likely to, have publications, had 3 times the publications, nearly double the presentations, 8-fold in terms of grand round presentations, and about 4-fold the amount of mentees. Unfortunately, what we did not see was any difference in grant funding and promotions. And that's where we in this group have to continue to work to push on our systems to say, hey, why are these folks doing what looks like to be the merit-based things that would normally get people promoted, but are not achieving those results? And I think with that, we'll say thank you very much, Sri. We appreciate your your kindness. And, I'll just throw our reference.
Yes.
There we go.
So we'll take like a 5-minute break if that sounds good. If you want to grab some coffee, the bathroom's around the corner as well too, and then we'll come back to have a couple workshops if that sounds good to actually practice the restorative justice as well as some upstander training.
Time, I had some Google slides that were Cassie and I will bring up. So I don't know this. You know, have you been able to download things?
I went to the speaker room just wanting to do it
Like the appropriate way.
I know they got me some trouble about it too. They're like, "Really download your like
I
intro
know that.
slide?" And I just downloaded all of ours. Kind of just like
Okay.
it's like we don't disclose. I don't trust them with the your kind of disclosure. That's why they're giving me so much trouble about it. I was doing it.
I
It's up to you. And I was just like, I'm not downloading their slides. I promise you. But then it was the same problem. Sure, that they changed theirs. So.
And I always forget, like every time. I know. Like I was like, oh, this is a sweater. It'll be okay. It's not. Is your you probably are you more? I just wanted to download it because I didn't. Man. Yeah, I was just like wasn't sure if I'm like you don't have. 'Cause I'm bad and didn't do what I was supposed to do. Oh, it's because it's a slash. Yeah. Act like you've used a computer before, for sure. Like what? All right. Now, before I close out of my email, I'll just like make sure that it actually. Oh yeah, there it is. Okay. So just make sure that it doesn't look crazy. All right, perfect. So I think what I'll do is I will just leave that there. And then I'm going to sign out of my email. Perfect. All right, perfect.
I was gonna say, so I got my speaker. Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, that sounds great. I think I'll just start, huh?
Hey guys, we're gonna kind of like pull it back together again, if that sounds good, and kind of jump into the next like actually hour or so is going to be a little bit more interactive. So you'll actually get to interact with the material, get to practice some of the things that we're teaching. But we're going to do a talk on going from bystander to upstander, so creating a safe and inclusive and equitable clinical environment. And this is really what's important for us to kind of show up into that space. And in our day-to-day work, it's really important to think about this, you know, as we go on shift. So we have no disclosure stuff. Once again, just to reemphasize about the being uncomfortable. It's okay to be uncomfortable because that's where we learn and grow. So you'll be doing some table work together just to kind of move things along. And then I just want to acknowledge that, you know, the work that we're presenting is kind of a curation of things that we have learned throughout the years from other talented experts in the field as well, too, that we want to share and make approachable to you. And here are our objectives. So we're going to talk about bias in all of its form. We're just planting the seeds again. So this is a scaffolding of what you've been hearing all morning. And then we're going to actually just go through some activities and actually teach you some strategies for microaggression and upstander training that you'll actually be able to apply. I thought it was not doing well. Thank you. Okay, perfect.
So as we get started, let's just refocus on why DEI matters so we all share the same foundation. I will not belabor this point. We're all here. We all know why it matters. And we all recognize the value of diversity in medicine. But we know that a diverse physician group leads to improved patient care and outcomes, enhanced cultural competence, better access to healthcare in low resource settings, and richer intellectual discussions among trainees. It brings countless advantages to the table, so it's important that we continue to foster it and embrace it. So while the diversity of healthcare is widely acknowledged, the reality unfortunately tells a little bit of a different story. So we still have a significant progress to make, not just in the US, but of course around the world. This QR code here is a study or recent analysis of the 20 largest ACGME residency specialties that revealed that none of the programs reflected Black or Latino representation at levels comparable to the national population. So it's not just a statistic, it's really a call to action. It really highlights the disparities in medical training and the critical need to create more equitable spaces. So some of you may ask how this can be. Of course, racism exists on all levels, from an unconscious belief that we hold to a systems-wide level. And because it's so embedded in our daily life, it's hard to recognize and of course even harder to change. Here are the different levels: systemic, inequalities maintained by society, of course, which we're all very acutely aware of; institutional, maybe schools, different programs hospitals hold; interpersonal, of course, among how we interact with each other; and then, of course, internalized in how we feel about ourselves. But we don't really need a table or a figure to show more examples of this, right? We all work in the ED. We see how racism exists, unfortunately, during every shift. We witness the disparities and inequities in healthcare, the lack of resources, and of course, how some patients are treated differently than others. But this also exists outside the walls of the ED, right? And within medical education.
So we want to just like quickly share kind of like how we see this infiltrate medical education, just so we can see the exercise well practice is actually for the clinical realm, but just to plant some seeds that we see this outside the, in our classroom setting. So of course we touch base that definitely the grades and letters of recommendations for our students kind of vary based on gender as well as URM status as well too. So the comments that are used are very different. And we see this actually in MSPs as well. This is a study that a lot of people use to talk about it. And on the kind of x-axis, you see kind of men versus women. Everyone above that line got honors, but you see the language is very different for the two, including some of the kind of stronger leadership words are used with men, such as like stand out or related to ability, versus communal words that are used for females, such as those grandstone or emphasizing like teaching and things like that, versus leadership, which is, you can imagine as you're reading 1,000 slows, for example, that might actually make you choose one student over another. And similarly, again, for URM versus non-URM, everyone above got honors. But you see, especially some of these tags here, like excellent, it's so heavily skewed to one side. So just be very thoughtful. And I pull this out when I'm writing my slows or writing my letters of recommendation so I could check my own bias. Or I'll sometimes be mean to myself and do it afterwards to see like where does my bias still exist, just so I can continue to learn and grow.
This also exists within honor societies as well. I'm sure all of you guys have heard of the AOA, a distinction commonly given to signal academic excellence. However, awards and accolades have been shown to be given less to students who are underrepresented. So in a study of nearly 5,000 students, AOA membership was 6 times more likely for white students than for Black students. So this can actually often be discriminatory and a disadvantage for those students, unfortunately. This also exists in standardized examinations. So of course, USMLE scores are frequently used as a screening tool to eliminate applicants early in selection processes. And additionally, just like all standardized tests, the USMLE is subjected to issues with accessibility and affordability with test preparation, can significantly impact those students as well.
And then just beyond the classroom is also with leadership. We call this the opportunity gap that exists. And this, again, applies to both URM as well as women in medicine, that we see that the med school classes are not representative of our outside community that we're serving. And then also for women in medicine, we know that there's a big pay gap as well as promotion gap that exists, including that we have less than 30% of women that will become associate professors and less than 20% that will ever obtain that professor status as well. And so this is where we can really be the light to kind of help lead the promotions and the work that we're doing to actually count towards promotions as we're moving forward.
So to transition gears a little bit, so bias, microaggressions, racism, they're not minor isolated events. These are continuous insults that create lasting damage on both the societal and individual level. So when people are excluded or repeatedly subjected to subtle acts of disrespect, the impact runs pretty deep. So what is the result? Increased anxiety, increased stress, feelings of hopelessness, in spaces that are often meant to offer care and safety. these are some examples of these death by 1,000 cuts that someone mentioned earlier. So micro assault, I think we all kind of familiar with these. Micro invalidations, maybe a female physician being called by her first name. Micro insults, so a physician assumed to be non-physician based on their appearance. Or environmental, so accolades of non-minority groups are amplified in public spaces. So it's important to talk about intent versus impact of the words that are said. So we often hear things like, oh, is English your first language? Where are you really from? And although the intent can initially be curiosity or be benign, the impact of that can actually be pretty harmful. So we have some examples here. So a comment here, wow, you're so well spoken. The intention is to give somebody a compliment, but of course the impact can be pretty negative of the recipient. I don't expect people of your race to be well spoken, or people of your race normally aren't well spoken, so of course that can be problematic. Another one, you don't look like you speak Spanish. Again, coming from a place of curiosity, but can be damaging there as well. Where are you from? This one, I think a lot of us fall into this trap because, of course, we want to learn about our students, learn about our residents, maybe even connect with them on some level. But this, of course, can be harmful, making them seem that they truly don't belong in this area. Where did you go to medical school? They may hear, are you really qualified to be my doctor? And then this last one, when you call someone by the wrong name, for example, this one, Anita, did you pass off the patient in room 6? Anita, oh, I mean Farah. So again, maybe coming from a place that's benign, you forgot her name, you haven't rotated for a while, but the impact of what someone might hear is that they are interchangeable. I wasn't worth your time to get your name to my memory, and I learned all my other colleagues' names before yours.
Just curious if anyone in the room has felt any or all of those. I was like yesterday on my shift, and I was just kidding. Well, actually, yes, that is true. So, or many times on a shift, right? I mean, it happens all day, every day. And I think we do need to be thoughtful that our learners are feeling this and they don't know what to say or if they're allowed to say anything, right? A lot of them will just say, like, keep my head down and work, and that's it. But you can imagine this can really disqualify how they feel and how they show up to the space and also how they ask questions because they may not feel like they're even, worthy of being in that space to learn. So this is where we can really be a light for our learners and build a lot of hope for them in kind of those dark times where they're being invalidated or even having like racist comments and things said to them to really kind of help them to shine and find their voice. And this is also where we can be a voice for them. And while we're talking, a lot of times we talk about race and gender, but there's a lot of intersections of bias that exists there. And we see this a lot, against weight, against, our frequent visitors to the ED. There's so many times that this kind of is just common language in the ED itself, and we tolerate it when we can actually be the voice to say, actually, maybe we shouldn't talk about that patient, or one day that frequent visitor to the ED is going to come in sick, and we need to recognize it because they will get sick, and we do need to be there for them. And so once again, there's not one way to do this or another way. You'll find your own voice, and the way I respond is going to be different than how Megan responds and so on. And so we really want to kind of like plant some seeds. And the other part is like, as we're planting these seeds, is kind of recognizing where your audience is. Are they in the fear zone or are they in the growth zone? And sometimes, as much as we want to grab them kicking and screaming and pull them all the way to the growth zone, we cannot. So think about what's in your locus of control that you can have impact in. And really by identifying some of these comments, you can really identify that person, plant a seed, and then kind of help them to grow and eventually get to that growth zone where we want everyone to be. And here's just a quick implicit bias if you want to use this. I think everyone has taken this probably multiple times. I take it often to check my own bias and learn and grow, but definitely this is a great tool to use. And so we just need to think about our role in this space to really step in and do faculty development, do resident training just to really help grow. And so that's where we're going to start kicking off our workshop.
So our workshop is surrounded by being an upstander. So this is a person who speaks or acts in support of an individual group or cause, especially someone who's being attacked or bullied. And there's 3 tenets to this. The first one is to directly address the behavior, perhaps by calmly but assertively calling out an inappropriate comment directed towards somebody. Support the person targeted, so check in with the person affected, and then report your incident. And being an upstander isn't about calling out the obvious injustices, right? It's also about stepping in when there's really subtle, everyday incidences of discrimination that can occur. All right, so this is our first small group activity. We're gonna go into smaller groups. Let's see, how many people do we have? You wanna just keep table by table?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
And we're going to use the 5Ds response toolkit. So if you want to go ahead and start us off.
Yeah. And what we'll do is, this is your first activity, and then Dr. Kennedy is going to be talking about restorative justice, and then you'll have another group activity as well too. So we'll have you kind of split up into tables to do this. But the 5Ds is a strategy that you can use that has all of these components, so direct, distract, delegate, delay, and document, that you can use to basically have a toolkit, because same as each of us will respond to a microaggression differently, our toolkit, we need to have a lot of things in there to be able to approach that. So I might pull this out for one patient, but I might use the lift method, for example, for another patient, or the erase method. And so just having a lot of toolkits can kind of help us. So we're going to walk through each one of these and then kind of explain the activity.
So a lot of these are pretty self-explanatory, so I will fly through these. So the first one, or the first D, is direct. So this is direct confrontation to the person engaging in harmful behavior directly. It's often the most assertive approach, where you address the situation head on. But it doesn't have to be rude or aggressive in any way. You can politely ask the person to stop their behavior. For example, hey guys, I don't think that this is appropriate. Please don't say that. So you can express disapproval without escalating a situation. Next is distract. So this one is where you can intervene by diverting attention away from the situation. So this can also be non-confrontational as a way to diffuse tension and protect the target of harm. There's ways to do this. You can create a diversion to interrupt the situation. So for example, you can ask the person being harassed a question to kind of change the subject, or make a loud comment to draw attention away, and again, change the subject and reorient the conversation. Next one is going to be delegate. So each situation is different. We can involve others who might be in a better position to help, such as different authority figures or people who are more directly involved in a situation. So you can find someone with authority, or just maybe like some more direct involvement, or just someone else to take charge. Next is delay. So especially in the ED, you may not be able to intervene in the moment, but you can provide support later. This allows you to check in with the person who was harmed and offer help after the incident has passed. And lastly is document. So if you feel unsafe or unable to intervene directly, you can record the incident, take notes, and this can help provide evidence or collateral later if needed. But make sure you safely do this. You can even do this discreetly after the event has happened, just to ensure you're not escalating a situation. And then you can share it later with the appropriate parties if necessary, or if the person harmed wishes to report it.
So we're going to have you do an activity. So I think each of the tables will actually, if you want to first scan the QR code, that would be great, just so that you can take a look at it. But we're actually going to have you look. We have a couple different scenarios there, so just talk as a group, kind of as you, and you can work through as many scenarios as you're able to. But we're going to just have you. It's a Google Doc, so you could type in your responses to those bullet points. But you look at the scenario and then kind of read through the different responses. And just remember, there's 5 Ds. You're not doing all 5 at the same time, because you can imagine being direct and delaying is very different. Those don't actually go together. And so decide, which one might be the best to actually approach that situation, and then write down the comment, like the actual words that you would say to do that. For example, if it's direct, say, that's not appropriate, or we're going to use professional behavior here. So write down the actual words that you might actually say. Do we want them to do tables, do you think?
Yeah, I think tables makes sense.
Yeah, so we'll probably have each of you kind of like hone in on one of the specific ones, if that sounds good. So we'll have, if you guys, actually we'll start back there. My med students could be direct, because you guys are awesome. So back table, if you guys want to look at direct for each of the scenarios and walk through that. For this table, if you want to do delay, that would be good. If you guys want to do documents for the last one, we have, sorry, I'm going up blank. Let me look at it.
Delegate.
Delegate, yeah, delegate, and then distract, yeah, thank you. And then what we'll do is we'll take about like 5 minutes or so to kind of do this, and then come back together to kind of read it. Thanks. Yeah, try to get through all 3, but definitely just the first 2 at the very least, and we'll talk about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know that's not what I asked. Yeah, yeah, that's only send them to. I'm still talking. Next year. That, you know, there's a series of events. So also just have looking where I did my
All right, guys, we hear a lot of fruitful discussion, but we want to kind of reel it in so we can move on for the sake of time. You guys all have the Google Doc on your phone, so I'll go ahead and just read out what we've accomplished so far. So scenario one, or with all of these scenarios, really, Sri and I took inspiration from things that we've rather experienced ourselves or have witnessed, unfortunately, throughout the years. So this first one, the scenarios, are you one of those DEI hires, or where are you really from? So first D is direct. Which table had direct? The back table. So an example that we use is, this language would not be appropriate. We treat everyone with respect in this department. Some other language that this table came up with that is very inappropriate. What you said is very hurtful. Can you explain to me why you're asking this question? I like that. It's not confrontational. It shows inquiry. Another thing that you guys wrote is, according to the student handbook, this line or questioning is not appropriate. So, maybe if this was a colleague that asked this or a supervisor perhaps could say that. All really great examples there. And then distract, what you guys came up with for that one was, quote, that's not relevant to the care today, which I also really like that. Or answering literally place of birth, not ethnic origin. And to remind everyone, it's just like, if you guys witness this, whoever's the target of that question is under no obligation to answer, and so speaking up for them from that standpoint too can be really helpful. Delegate, so it depends on who the interaction is between, is what you guys wrote. If it's a resident, then we may need to involve the PD. If it's a patient, maybe consider including PVR. I'm not quite sure what that means.
Patient visitor
relations. Okay. Which of course could also be great. Delay. So who had delay? Which table here? Okay, I heard some really fruitful discussion over there. So if you guys wrote, if you are the observing colleague, check with them later in a way that shifts the focus and doesn't make assumptions. Check in with the colleague stating, quote, I wanted to check in with you. I personally found that statement offensive to me and wanted to check in with you. I think that's great. Shifts the focus. It doesn't make assumptions, because I think a lot of us, we can fall into that trap, and a lot of people, I think, fear falling into that trap. So just coming from a place of concern, coming from a place of wanting to support is always a great place to start.
I'd be mindful of who's in the room too, because if you only go and talk to the person who was like kind of the person who was being attacked, if you will, and stuff too, and there's other learners in the room, if they don't actually see that you addressed it, they might actually think that you're condoning that activity as well too. And the other thing is, if you do go and speak up for someone else, make sure afterwards you do check in with them. There's a savior complex that they talk about in bias training as well too. And so while we want to advocate for others, we don't want to take their voice or their autonomy as well too. So this is where probably delay, no matter what, is part of the conversation. I think of it as delay/debrief is the kind of that
And then for documentation, the group wrote, state specifically what was said, by whom, and to whom. Disclose if you are a mandatory reporter, so the affected party isn't caught by surprise. I like that. Consider timing, and understand the options depending on the person. So faculty versus staff versus patient. I think that's also a really important insight.
So we're going to move to like the restorative justice piece now. So you see there's other scenarios there that you could definitely practice. Yeah, go ahead, Ernesto.
I was just going to say that this is really an opportunity also at a systemic and structural level of creating mechanisms for reporting. And so we have a program, and there's QR codes everywhere. And so that really makes it a system-wide institutional priority.
Exactly. And also, like, I would say for the documenting too, if you want to correct the behavior, if it keeps happening, this is where you can put banners on your patients' charts and stuff about inappropriate behavior and stuff, and also protect your learners and your nurse and staff as well too. Because if there's inappropriate behavior, you don't want them to be going into that room alone and things like that. So just be thoughtful of how we can be the advocates for them.
To piggyback off that, like, having a zero tolerance policy of some kind in the department and giving reference in these real-time situations is really a nice way to sort of, just be able to point to something and say, like, it's not necessarily 100% well, I'm not attacking you, but hey, we have a zero tolerance policy for it. These sorts of comments and things like that is very helpful.
I think that in reality, though, like QR codes and things may, even in these policies, may be a good mechanism to have. Like, I don't know how much, number one, people are actually reporting this, and number two, like, you also, by doing these kinds of things, are affecting the patient-physician relationship as well. So, if the person is just, oh, I didn't mean anything by it, then you destroy that relationship. So I think it's kind of a case-by-case thing too.
Yeah, correct. I think each patient, it depends on what the actual, encounter entailed as well too. But I definitely think like having a system-wide kind of like policy that you're following and reinforcing it. This is where you can also teach your staff what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, and making it about professionalism and, bringing the care forward for your patient is kind of the most important thing. So we'll hand it over to Dr. Kennedy then to talk about restorative justice and how to actually put it in action.
All right. Thanks again, y'all. And my name is Ken Kennedy. I know we touched a little bit earlier on restorative justice or restorative practices a little bit earlier, but we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into it and then actually kind of put into practices some of the things that we've kind of learned here today. I will also say too that the amount of time that we have allotted for restorative justice practices or just trying to understand what this is not enough. So for me, I went through, I think, a 2-day course in order to kind of think about restorative justice, restorative practices, do multiple case scenarios, work through some things. And so in the 10 to 15 minutes that I have to kind of talk about this, it's definitely not enough to kind of drive home the points of what we are trying to accomplish. But what we do want to do is try to understand some of the highlights, understand ways in which we can kind of take this back to our own institutions and to our team, and to make sure that we are doing the things that we need to do in order to make sure that our team dynamics stay good. So I think to kind of set the stage for all of this, it's important for us to kind of think about what we do. So in emergency medicine, we try our best to kind of go into a patient's room, diagnose the problem, fix that problem, and then move on. But what happens when the team dynamics gets disrupted and there's some difficulty in the trust that exists between multiple members of the team? How do we then move on from that? How do we then kind of recreate the sanctity of the relationship and make sure that everyone in the team feels heard, healed, and can move forward in a good manner? So what we're going to do is kind of talk through some of those things and try to give you some of those highlights. So again, I have no financial disclosures, and these are the objectives as they are stated here. Again, define restorative justice. We're going to differentiate restorative justice from other principles of justice that we've seen before. We're going to explore how restorative justice practices can support learning, equity, and healing. And then ultimately, we're going to try our best to go through some of these case scenarios and work through some of those. So as one of my colleagues a bit ago kind of defined restorative justice, just to kind of re-emphasize what this is, it's ultimately this ethical framework that exists that looks at repairing harm as a whole. What we try to do is to bring in all the affected parties into this collaborative process to ultimately make sure that the person who has been affected is both heard and understood. So as I mentioned before, it came from these indigenous traditions previously, but it ultimately kind of emphasized 3 specific things: community, interconnectedness, and then ultimately collective healing. And so what we've tried to do is kind of shift our focus away from what is punishment and blame to much more of healing and ultimately accountability as well. Now, as we talked about before, this isn't the first time we've kind of talked about restorative justice or seen it in practice. Most notably, we've probably seen it in practice in the context of criminal justice systems and how we've kind of tried to reform some of those things. But the good thing for us is that it's kind of made its way into academia and then into medicine as well. And so ultimately kind of gives us this toolbox to now start to understand and kind of get away from the question of figuring out what rule was broken and start to move toward a few different types of questions. Ultimately, we're going to try to understand what happened, who was harmed, what are the needs, what is the institution's responsibility in kind of healing those harms, and then ultimately, how do we then move forward together, right? So it's only until after we kind of understand the dynamics of the situation at hand, the conflict that has occurred, can we then move forward in a better and healed way. So we're going to take a little bit of a look at the principles of restorative justice as a whole. So ultimately, we're going to try our best to just repair the harm. So we're going to focus on that. And instead of kind of focusing on understanding the rule violation of what was kind of pushed aside, we're going to try our best to understand what the impact was. And Dr. Notation and Rivera did a good job of kind of thinking about impact versus intent. So what is the impact of the behavior? And then ultimately kind of creating this environment where people feel safe and heard. We also want to be thoughtful about inclusive decision making, being thoughtful about centering the voices that were harmed and making sure that they are involved in the conversation as well. I think we also have to be very thoughtful about making sure that there is some type of accountability. And so again, kind of going back to that idea of intent versus impact, and then we want to make sure that we repair these relationships and recreate reintegration. And then lastly, we want to make sure that the community as a whole is involved in the patient's, not patients, good Lord, involved in the reestablishment of community for those two individuals who may have been involved in some type of conflict. So both for the offender and the offended, making sure that, again, that they realize that they are still very much a part of the team. So traditionally, we've talked about these ideas of punitive versus restorative justice. We've talked about specifically with restorative justice, our focus has been much more on the context of who was harmed and what are the needs, and then ultimately trying to understand and address the underlying causes of the behavior itself, not understanding the underlying causes of the behavior, not just the behavior itself, and then contrasting that with the punitive aspects of justice, where the question is not so much about who was harmed, but much more in the context of what rule was broken, and then ultimately what is the punishment that is deserved. Now, I think one of the things that people will sometimes get misconstrued is that they will feel that there is no accountability in restorative justice practices. But I would argue that the person who has done the harming is held in responsible for their actions in a little bit of a different way. And we do this by making sure that they are having an environment where there is a supportive learning environment, there is growth, there is healing, and then ultimately where they don't feel like they are alienated but from the rest of the group, and that there is just simply a punishment. As Dr. Notation and Rivera mentioned, there is upstander training, and when we compare that to what restorative justice practices are, we kind of see that upstander training kind of focuses much more on the context of preventing a problematic situation from occurring or intervening immediately after something has occurred, whereas restorative justice practices is much more in the context of healing the harm as a whole. We've talked a little bit about some of the benefits, and of course, there's a few more here that I won't necessarily just read off, but needless to say that we're trying our best to make sure that we are healing the harm of the individual that was offended, but then also kind of preserving the team dynamics here as well. We recognize that these practices have been in existence for a while, and so the AAMC actually established a pilot program several years ago to help to teach and spread the restorative justice practices that were out there, and then to ultimately kind of evaluate the potential impact within academic medicine. And so what they found was that there was improved relationships among students and faculty, also understanding that there was an enhanced learning environment, and then decreasing the number of incidences of mistreatment. So I put the QR code here if you are interested in learning more about that pilot program, and then to also sign up for any of their restorative justice practice workshops as well if you're so interested. I also think it's important that we kind of identify and think about some of the barriers that may exist to implementing restorative justice practices within our own institutions. And I think it's important that we identify those because they may be things that are brought up if we are to do this within our own institutions. We talked a little bit earlier about having restorative circles, right? And so someone may say, then we don't have time for these restorative circles. But the truth is that doing this restorative work does take a lot less time than dealing with the fallout that may exist from dealing with the things on the back end. So all the disengaged teams, the moral injury that may occur, and then the overall repeated conflict. The second thing we kind of think about is this idea of hierarchy and power dynamics. We obviously know that academia and medicine is this deeply hierarchical structure, and learners may feel that there is some concern for retaliation if they report or say something, and then faculty may feel a bit exposed if they are in this conversation with a person that they perceive to be their inferior. And so we need to make sure that as we are doing this work, that we are building the psychological safety net so that way we can expect and get honest dialogue between the two individuals. Third, we kind of think about this misunderstanding of what restorative justice is. And, I think part of what people may perceive is that restorative justice is soft or that it lacks accountability. But I would argue that we kind of hold people accountable in a little bit of a different way, as I mentioned before, but then also understanding that restorative justice practices can also be done alongside other things. So making sure that we heal the harm, but then also making sure that people are held responsible for the things that they do. We also think about the idea of having lacking trained facilitators and institutional support. I think my colleague a little bit earlier mentioned that his institution stopped at tier 2. And I think part of that may be from just making sure that, there is this infrastructure and the support that is needed in order to make sure that these practices are done in a skillful and neutral way, and to make sure that there is the support both financially and from a buy-down standpoint where people are able to kind of do this and do it effectively. And then the last thing we'll think about as well is this emotional discomfort that exists. This work can be uncomfortable, and people are being asked to kind of sit with this harm, to name the impact, and then ultimately to be accountable for those things as well. But when people are uncomfortable, it does not mean that you run away from that discomfort. It means that there is work that is being done, and then we are being stretched in a way that will allow us to be better as a team. So with that being the background of where we are, let's go to a little bit of a small group activity. I'm going to present a few case discussions as a whole. I'm going to ask each group at their own table to kind of just answer 4 questions for us. When you see these case scenarios, I want you to ask, what happened? Who was harmed? What are the needs? And then what does repair look like? So we have our first case here, and I'll let you all read it amongst your own groups. But again, what we'll try to do is answer the 4 questions of what happened, who was harmed, what are the needs, and then what does repair look like? We'll take about 2 or 3 minutes to kind of work through some of that. All right. In the interest of time, we'll go ahead and wrap this one up. Um, so if I can have a volunteer from any table at all, um, what happened in this particular scenario?
Someone let their inside thought be outside.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Just to kind of put a few more words to that, and thank you, Cassie. I appreciate you. There was a biased and dehumanizing comment that was made, and it was done so in a clinical setting, and then obviously someone was affected by that biased and dehumanizing comment. Next question may be somewhat obvious and maybe not so much as well. Who was harmed in this particular situation? Can you speak a little bit more about that?
So the scenario calls out the nurse, but I mean, that resident is harmed. And that patient is potentially harmed because the way they're treated may be different because that label has been attached to them. I often talk about you don't know where the ears are around you. You don't know who else is hearing things. And so, any patient who happened to overhear that, these are loud. I mean, we live in a fishbowl, right? And it's loud, so people can hear what is being said. So any patient who hears that is like, wait, is that what they think of me? Or, oh, this person in authority is okay saying that, nobody's saying anything about it, so I can use those terms as well.
Absolutely. I don't think I have much more to add to that. I think understanding just the team itself is also affected because there's that erosion of trust that is there as well. And I think you eloquently articulated all the other players that may be in this as well. So thank you. So what are the needs here in order to move forward?
Needs are checking in with those who are visibly affected, offering an opportunity to reframe those and see their actions as being positive.
Absolutely. And again, just put a few more words to that. The nurse would probably need to be heard and validated, feel psychologically safe. as we mentioned before, the resident may need to feel supported as well as they kind of reflect on their own biases and, whether it was intentional or not, thinking about their impact and intent versus their intent, and then ultimately kind of finding ways in which they can find tools to practice cultural humility. And then, as we mentioned before, the team itself may just need reaffirmation of the shared values that we have as a whole. All right, and then the last question that I'll have is, what does accountability and repair look like here?
Going back to the need,
Yes.
I think it also is an opportunity to say, how do we deal with what we see, and how have we built grit, and how has that grit potentially been maladaptive in some ways, and an opportunity to have broader discussions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
And I think also the piece of engagement, right? Like, depending on how earlier, like, there's some risk to them regardless.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a different need to address it if they were only
Oh,
enough to have departments.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think to piggyback on that, their clinical needs as well. Like, I think, assessing the scenario now, we need to be extra attentive that patients' needs being managed effectively, that tasks are being completed effectively, and that care has not been compromised. Kind of a bias.
Absolutely. Yes and yes.
I think I just also want to do a little bit more of a look at the institutional kind of approach and feelings towards these patients. Because if you're feeling that comfortable in such a public setting where you're in a leadership role, to say that so freely, it just kind of begs the question of, is this an undercurrent that we're kind of really moving forward?
Absolutely.
And is this just a one-time thing, or is this amongst all of our?
Well, that's a really good point. Yes, ma'am. Did you have another point as well?
I was going to say that I think that there's repair on the individual level, but then there's repair on a larger institutional or departmental level, where, to echo what you're saying, we really need to look at what is our perspective on the patients that we serve, and how are we communicating our values internally as well as externally.
Was just as well as in the highlight what Victoria just mentioned. There was we have a champion faculty that a number of years ago sought to change the attitude of intoxicated patients in our department. Our patients are not drunk, our patients are intoxicated. That language is insulting and it's biasing. And we will call that out and we'll address it, but if we don't have the rest of the team, including the nurses, staff, or EMTs, and so they're using that, and it breaks down those in the progress that we did. So when it's quiet, then you can do all you want among the physician resident staff, but the culture of the department doesn't continue to us.
Yeah. This idea of like labeling people, I think the most common example we've given is those with sickle cell anemia being called sicklers and things of that nature as well. So.
One other thing we mentioned at our table was that the individual repair is probably best done in private with kind of an inquiry-based, hey, why did you say that? What was going on in your head? Did you notice how this impacted your teammates? Have you thought about how having that construct in your head might influence how you take care of this patient? You thought about how the patient might feel hearing that, their family member or other people, and doing that in private and having that conversation so that they don't put up their businesses right off the bat.
Absolutely.
And then not learn and not potentially change the
Absolutely.
behavior.
Absolutely. Yes.
We also talked about on a one-on-one basis, like that resident probably also needs to talk to that nurse, and the likelihood of bungling that conversation, high. More like someone else probably needs to be present to help facilitate that conversation. Or the resident's going to need to be coached on that. And a lot of that's going to rely on what the patient, like what the resident's relationship to that nurse was previously is going to matter a whole lot. But this nurse is never going to look at this person the same way again. So thinking about like, hey, I'm sorry, I didn't realize like how this was going to impact everybody else. I'm sorry, here's that offended you. That was not my intent. I had learned from this experience such and such and such. I think there was a long way there. But we also can't expect our learners to come up with that on their own. And so part of that one-on-one conversation
no matter what happy our needs being, hey, you might want to touch base with the nurse and here's, needs and thoughts being open, especially when y'all can have kids. It's gonna be important moving forward if y'all take care of people together, that you feel like.
And it sounds like what you all are getting at is this idea of like accountability and what that repair is starting to look like. Because again, we're going to have those facilitated circles, but then we're also going to try to make sure that that resident expresses accountability, and then not just offer like a simple apology, because an apology is just not going to cut it. We're going to hit here, and then we'll come back here.
I just want to add as well, I think that those of us in this room and others should be modeling both the repair behavior as well, because we make mistakes.
Absolutely.
I've done things, right? Or things have been interpreted in a wrong
Absolutely.
way, but owning that and showing how you own that as well can also be demonstrative and beneficial.
Absolutely. And just having humility about it as a whole. Absolutely.
Yeah, I love that, and I think also a shout out for community agreements,
Mhm.
and having an infrastructure for being able to call things out in a softer way potentially. So I love hoops and ouch. But to Mandy's point about how the complexities of, especially at my institution, it's a university in a hospital system with about 1 zillion EMT, but I think as the sort of traditional leaders, starting by modeling it, and hopefully that engaging people in discussions can be a way of really taking one bad scenario and making things better, or being preventative.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you all for. Yes, sir.
Last thing,
Mhm.
the question that I have is like, who should maybe have those conversations, right? Because where we take the medical students as well, residents, that resident in the conversation has to, I guess, maybe begin with the knowing that they're not like in trouble for doing this. So who's the best to have that? The team that's on, obviously has their responsibility, program director. The question I had is, I'm thinking about this, is like, you want to have somebody that have that conversation in a free way, so the residents feel comfortable building and developing rather than feeling or
So this is where. Oh, sorry. This is where like having those restorative justice facilitators in-house come into practice, and those people who have kind of gone through that training will be helpful to have. At our institution, we have something called civility champions, which are these individuals who have kind of gone through these restorative justice principles and work through those things. And so we are the ones that are designed to kind of go through and actually help walk them through that. And I think making sure that people know who those individuals are in their individual departments will be helpful in making sure that they get the help and that they need, and like to be able to facilitate those discussions.
Sorry, I know we are transitioning, and a lot of us have talked about our background presentations, but if you are not on the WAMC's email list, I highly recommend it. They're having an in-person training session August 13th through 15th. If you are interested, if you want to learn more about this program and bringing it to your respective institutions, I did it with the WAMC program. It is, I think, truly life-changing to change the environment for your respective institutions.
Absolutely. I had a few different case scenarios as well. We won't have enough time to go through all of those, but definitely want to make sure that I say thank you all for listening and being interactive, and then just kind of making sure that we are just kind of pushing the conversation away from just having punishment for the individual who was doing the offending, and making sure that it goes much more to accountability and making sure they understand what their actions are. So again, thank you and appreciate you. Thank you. Okay, sorry, I need to go to your time.
No, John, you'll have time. And then, because like I have to help on this entire so this is a kind
All right, good morning. Well, I'm John Perrical. I'm one of the emergency physicians at Duke University School of Medicine. One of the benefits of going towards the end of these sessions is that we can make up a little bit of time because some of my colleagues have already covered a lot of things that are going to be built into this, so we don't have to go into too much detail into some of those topics. Goal for today is to talk about health equity and how do we build that into the education we provide to our learners, to our residents, as well as into our clinical practice, trying to use some evidence-based examples here on how to integrate it in. And certainly, having worked at a few different institutions, I should preface all of this by saying that, gauge sort of what's already been tried at your institution, see what sort of pitfalls they've run into with that. Not to say that you shouldn't try again and differently, but it's certainly helpful to inform your decision making as you're trying to make changes someplace. And every place is further along in this journey towards health equity and reducing health disparities. So understanding that when you go to someplace, they might be not as far along as maybe the place you trained. If you're a resident, making the jump to attendinghood, or if you're changing jobs from different institutions as an attending. So keeping all that perspective in mind, the goalposts might change a little bit depending on the institution, but the overall goal is to make progress, right? So we'll jump right in here. So our objectives today, again, talking about how to incorporate health equity into our EM education, both in conference as well as bedside teaching, identify operational health equity interventions and ways that you can integrate into clinical practice, and then evaluate your curriculum and operational impact. So why is health equity in emergency medicine important? Well, obviously we know there's disparities in care. Some have been already mentioned, but in terms of looking at our triage to pain medication time, or how certain patients are treated based on race, or looking at things from an intersectionality standpoint, we know there's a lot of data out there that there's disparities in care. And if you were to think about all of the features of where bias comes into play, right? When you think about fast-paced environments, using pattern recognition, relying on historical sort of evidence in your own gestalt, right? If you were to design a blueprint, you use a blueprint or design something of where would be the place where the most bias would come into play. It's probably the triage area of an emergency department, right? Or in any of the rooms for that matter, because we're in this high stakes, high paced environment all the time, and all of the things that are risk factors for bias are very highly prevalent in where we work. And so we know that leads to increased disparities in care. And that's why we're all here today. Secondly, we know social determinants of health and unmet social needs are certainly areas where we can make high impact as emergency providers. The emergency department is the social barometer for the community that it serves, and we certainly can make small steps by trying to screen patients and figure out what needs we can address for them, or what part of our treatment plans might fall short depending on what their unmet social needs are. And finally, health equity is quality, and integrating it into your QI efforts, integrating it into M&M, into how you do your audits into how you do your audits at your department. It helps to improve safety, access, and care for all patients. So first, we're going to start with how to incorporate equity into our EM conferences. There's a lot of different ways to do this, certainly starting with something as small as implementing a quarterly or even once a semester, right? Making the goals attainable to start if you don't have anything in place from an EM conference standpoint. We've tried different models at Duke where we've had kind of a year-long curriculum. We've also had, and we still have, a health equity day where we have kind of a different theme each year, and we try to bring in speakers to speak around that theme. The goal would be longitudinal if you can, but certainly every place is a little bit different in how they structure conference and the content they want to cover. So there's workarounds for that too, where you can develop health equity tracks, right, or health equity journal clubs, finding ways to sort of where maybe you aren't taking up as much conference time, but you can sort of still address those topics. Other things you can do is looking at your clinical cases with an equity analysis, right? So you can still present the same topic or present the same cases, but then take an equity lens to it. So we have a requirement at our institution that you have to have one slide that in some way addresses health disparities or talks about sort of an equity-based issue in this case. It can be something as small as talking about drug prices if you can't find another example within the topic, right? But making it a requirement and kind of building that into conferences is really important. You can create speaker guidelines too, right? So as you're soliciting or asking whether it's grand round speakers or speakers at your institution, but sort of having guidelines as to what language you try and stray away from, right? We try not to use certain words like as we were talking about, sickler or drunk, or whether it's non-compliant or drug seeking, right? We want to try and make sure that we're being kind of very holistic in our approach to what we request from our speakers. So you can have a one-page, sort of tip sheet that you give when you send out those emails saying like, hey, here's the sign up for conference for the year, and here's sort of the requirements for conference if you are going to sign up, and here's some tips and tricks for how to deliver a good conference. But part of that, or a good lecture, part of that should be though how to approach topics like this. And then, in terms of tools that you can use, again, having an equity consideration or a mandatory sort of like at some point, inflection point, and maybe just being the people in the room who sort of bring up that question for each topic. So like, where do we see kind of disparities in care with this topic, right? Similarly, having rotating equity champions. So that can be somebody like a faculty member who reviews conference and reviews sort of the conference schedule and sees, maybe tries to help out with areas where you can incorporate equity-based information into lectures. So they can maybe reach out to the speakers individually or just offer some references, things like that, just to help them along. Because a lot of folks who are coming in to give a talk about trauma might not necessarily think about including EMS response times varying by zip codes, right? They might not necessarily know that data. They might be talking about a very specific trauma topic. But if it's a way to incorporate, if there's a way to incorporate that data, or you've seen literature out there that might be useful, if you have an equity champion or someone who's a faculty mentor or a faculty member rather, who is responsible for that, it's very useful that they could be sort of that point person to help with developing lectures, and even if it's as simple as incorporating like one line, one bullet point, that's something, right? That's still progress. And then tracking learner feedback, also really important. There's evidence out there that shows that even just quarterly exposure, doing post-survey analyses after even quarterly lectures related to health equity can improve learners' sort of confidence in tackling these efforts. So there's really kind of small steps you can do, and then obviously the bigger ones around developing like longitudinal curriculums and things like that. That's a much bigger lift. But there are definitely small ways that you can do this by not necessarily needing additional funding. It's just really what you ask of the speakers that are coming in. Moving on to the bedside here, there's a lot of things that we can do at the bedside, and depending on the institution and what resources you have, but certainly kind of even in just our interactions with our residents or our learners, talking about social determinants of health or unmet social needs in real time as it comes up. So, all right, this patient has been to the ED 3 times in the last couple of weeks for heart failure. Like, what does their social support look like? What are they having a difficult time accessing their meds? What are we seeing as the attending? You want to provide great teaching about heart failure in that example, but you also want to provide maybe some examples of other things that the learner or the resident can think about as they are interviewing the patient or examining the patient to sort of ask about outside of our typical social questioning. So certainly doing it in real time as you're having a resident staff with you is really important. But there's also opportunities for pausing and reflecting. So the ones I think are really useful to do this in are whenever you have issues when you have around psychiatric or behavioral issues, right? So if you have an agitated patient that requires some sort of behavioral response team, to show up, and you have to use either meds or restraints on that patient, right? You deem it unsafe for staff for whatever reason, but after the fact, right? Taking a second to say, okay, is there anything we could have done differently there, right? How do people feel about how that happened, and what things could have been communicated more clearly? Could we have tried anything else before we got to that? In some instances, of course, the answer is going to be no, right? But I think it's the idea of almost debriefing immediately after situations, these high intensity situations that come up similarly with traumas or codes, if we think that there's anything that comes up in the course of that. So creating pause and reflection moments. And then prompting critical thinking. One thing that I mention to learners all the time when I'm hearing about a dispo plan for discharge is that what things about this patient's social situation, right, or unmet social needs are going to impact this treatment plan. Because you can have the best treatment plan, imaginable for a patient that you're going to discharge. But if you have not thought about the unmet social needs or the barriers to care that that person has, that plan is going to fall flat, right? And we know for the million reasons why that is. So really getting your learners to think about that when they're coming up with a treatment plan for a patient, as to what are the non-medical factors in this person's life that are going to impact this plan that we have. Evaluating impact. So certainly collecting learner feedback is really important. So that's self-assessments, asking them how confident they feel about addressing disparities in care, and certainly when you have sessions in conference, saying did this session help to shift or change how you think about follow-up or disposition. So even brief equity curriculum improved bias awareness and increased comfort in addressing disparities in real time. There's a study out there in WestGem from Anderson that mentioned that. Track patient-centered metrics. So we want to looking at getting together with whoever does your dashboards or is monitoring sort of from a QI standpoint, looking at the metrics of the department and sort of starting to ask them to set it up in a way that you can start to help analyze that data or look at that data with an equity lens, right? Because a lot of times these folks are not people who are necessarily trained in how to do that. And so, showing them, how we can sort of look at time to analgesia or race or language-based issues that can come up. And also introducing the idea of intersectionality that, hey, these separate items that make up a patient's identity, individually have increased risk for X, Y, or Z bad outcomes. And if you put them all together, we might identify very high-risk groups that are having worse outcomes within our own department. And so I think, using data to your advantage, and certainly as AI, there's a lot of discussion around AI moving forward, and there's a lot of cautionary tales there too, because we just want to be very careful in how we approach that. But I think that there's certainly ways to use the data that we have already and make sure that we're not missing opportunities to intervene when we have very high-risk patients for bad outcomes based on the data that we have. And then finally, as I already mentioned, incorporating equity into, your QI and your M&M, that's also really important. So we talked already about bias surveys, implicit bias surveys, and administering those to learners as well as to the faculty, right? When you do chart reviews, every department has different ways of doing chart reviews, making sure that you're asking questions around care delivery and if there were disparities in care that were or were not addressed in this case, because you want to point out the wins too, right? And making sure that when you go through cases or M&Ms, that you're also identifying success stories there too. But certainly, being able to put together areas where the department as a whole can improve. And then, we talked about a little bit about the dashboard review as well. How many people are familiar with the 5 A's framework for social care delivery? So if you haven't seen it, in 2019, there was a pretty interesting article, but it was posted by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and they are basically they talked about the 5 A's for incorporating social care into healthcare delivery. Now, this slide is specific to bedside teaching, and so it's actually published by a medical student at Harvard who went to Duke for undergrad and actually worked with me on some stuff before he left for medical school, Sahil Sandhu. But he actually published an article about how to incorporate those same 5 A's, awareness, adjustment, assistance, alignment, and advocacy, into bedside teaching. So we've talked about these a little bit, but this is useful, and certainly I advise you to look up you can look up this article, but also the original 5 A's article from the academies. But awareness is sort of just being aware of what social factors are impacting patients' health in general, right? So when you hear about a patient, understanding which of their unmet social needs or their social situation might be impacting their health outcomes. So the patient who is a diabetic, who's also using food stamps, understanding that patient is going to have a very hard time adhering to a low-carb diet because it is much cheaper to buy or to utilize food stamps for processed foods than it is to buy fresh, organic foods, right? And things like, or not even organic, but just fresh vegetables and fruit. So knowing those sorts of things and how you can, just being aware of them, right, is very useful for our learners. Adjustment, so modifying care plans as you hear about them to account for unmet social needs. Assistance is connecting patients with appropriate resources that may be available, whether it's in the community or that your institution offers. And then alignment, ensuring that your care plan works within the patient's realities, and trying to utilize kind of a multimodal approach to that too. So, not just community resources, not just your institutional resources, but kind of putting it all together and making sure that they have a follow-up plan involving primary care. And then advocacy is, once you've identified systemic issues, because you've been doing this or reviewing the data, how do you advocate for change on a bigger level? Everybody, to some extent, does this in their departments, and certainly this is it can be very difficult depending on where you are and sort of how how much this will impact throughput through the department, whether you're asking the triage nurses to do it or or somebody else. But we know that having some structured screening tools to identify unmet social needs is really important. The biggest thing, though, is that once you've done that, having something in place to actually provide help and assistance, right? Because just identifying those needs alone is not really sufficient. It's falling short for our patients there. So when you screen with structure, not just when someone looks like they might need to be asked these questions, right? But maybe trying to do it on a universal or near universal level, you identify more people and connect, and then can leverage that information to develop more resources to provide help for them, right? And so that's something that doing a needs assessment, if your institution doesn't have a social needs screening program already, to see, hey, what are the most common needs of our patient population, and what are we actually able to provide for our patients to accommodate those. Having dedicated staff, so obviously social workers or case managers being the main points. These are folks who, they're not just dealing with like the difficult dispos and the psych placement, but like they know the community organizations, right? They develop relationships within the community, so they know which places are likely to be able to help certain patients, not just geographically, but with their medical conditions that they might have. And having 24-hour case management is something to work towards if you don't already have that. And then in addition to that, there's other things we're going to mention later on here that you can do to help sort of offset some of the lift that case managers and social workers have to deal with. And then outcomes tracking, right? So this is very difficult to do, but having some way to track how your referrals or how the plans that you've put into place with case management actually go for those patients. Who is following up with them? If you're leaving it all up to primary care, and this is not a patient who's established with primary care, there's a good chance that no one is following up on this, right? And so it makes it really hard to track, number one, how successful your initiatives are if you have no way to follow up with patients and see how they're doing. To understand if certain interventions that you're trying to put through are actually worth doing. And this is this is our white whale, like in terms of what we're trying to do. It's really, really difficult to follow up with patients who have left the emergency department to see if our referral to a community-based organization or kind of plan to address some unmet social need has actually happened. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but certainly, if anyone has the solution for that one, please let us know, because it is a difficult task. Because if you're not doing it as part of a research study where they've signed up for it and there's some incentive for them to answer the phone, or whatever the case is, a lot of times you're not going to get them to pick up that phone to sort of do a post intervention follow-up. And we oftentimes have to leave that to the primary care provider if they end up going to see somebody. Improving clinical practice through equity interventions. So we have sorry, how am I doing on time? I don't want to go over here. Okay. So really quickly, community partnerships. So finding out what community partnerships in your area can help, whether it's food pantries that you can give out information to patients who have food insecurity, housing, sort of knowing what is available to you. In North Carolina, we have something called NC Care 360, which is a in part government-based platform that's available to everybody in the state of North Carolina, but you can create referrals to community organizations within your area based on geography and the patient's address, and then you can actually track those referrals. But we also are fortunate to have other things like Duke Well, which is a group of case managers that the institution provides that basically follow up with patients routinely and help address a lot of these unmet social needs too. So we have a couple different ways that we can do it, and certainly the institution-specific one being kind of the gold standard, I think. Access expansion, so making sure that you have you have interpreter availabilities for patients with language needs, right? Making sure, if telehealth is something that you can expand or do for rural communities, if you have a significant rural population that seeks care at your department, thinking of different ways that you can improve access. One big thing for us was we made an effort to have iPads available in every treatment space. So there was never this barrier to I have to go to, search for the iPad or go find it. It's like, we have one available every place. We have ways to track them down. It makes it so that it reduces those time and effort barriers that a lot of times we will, people who aren't necessarily as motivated as everybody in this room might be to like, oh, I'll just use my broken 8th grade Spanish and try and, interpret what this patient's saying. Like that obviously is not standard of care. And then quality framework, there's resources at the end I'll show, but ACEP has a framework for measuring and addressing not just racial disparities in care, but also around language and other demographic information. Overcoming barriers. We've heard a lot of these excuses before, and certainly, some of them, depending on where you're coming from, can be harder than others to overcome, but, lack of faculty expertise, whether it's hosting workshops, doing the small things, right, where we're asking them to implement 1 slide per lecture, things like that. Start with small steps there, but just like, we had providers who historically didn't use ultrasound or weren't trained in ultrasound, now everybody is required to sort of be proficient in ultrasound. Similarly, we can look at this as something that's like a, novel, new thing for some of our older providers that all of the younger learners are getting in their education, as was mentioned earlier, right? Medical school curriculum, undergraduate curriculums are all covering this. So they're coming in with, greater level of understanding than most of us that have been practicing for 5+ years got in our training. Making sure that your leadership understands that these outcomes are tied to clinical excellence, right? So it's not, it's not necessarily DEI, but it's patient safety, it's clinical excellence, and it's quality improvement. So reframing, the discussion and showing the evidence that there is evidence out there that's showing that tying equity efforts to existing accreditation standards and QI initiatives helps overcome resistance and align work with broader institutional goals. Burnout or apathy. So, if you, in that case, using what we already have in place, right, and trying not to make the lift too much. So using whether that's like we were talking about with conference or doing things like on shift with your residents in your bedside teaching. You can start small there. Conversely, the counter argument is pick really high impact things to go after so people actually see the change that can be made when you do that. So whichever one you feel is more appropriate for your group, but you can either start really small or you can say, hey, I'm going to go for something that there's proven evidence of high impact here from the literature, and then they will see that effort is towards something that is going to create significant change. Finally, the too busy perceptions, again, we're talking about just making adjustments into existing workflows, adding on, and then the resistance to change here, framing things as quality improvement as opposed to, some sort of a political movement or something like that, right? I think it's how we have the conversation with folks so we can meet them where they are. And so things you can do now to wrap up, again, talking about, creating even once a semester or once a quarter type lectures and conference, train your faculty on bias awareness, as we've already talked about a couple times today, tracking outcomes and sharing progress. So sharing wins just as much as you focus on the negatives or the areas where you can improve, integrating equity into existing forums, and then developing scalable operations, whether that's using student volunteers or healthcare volunteers to help with social needs screening or the follow-up aspect of social needs screening. That's something that Stanford has a model for, that we have a model for. I'm sure a lot of other institutions have similar models for. But being this is an academic conference, right? All of us, or many of us in this room have access to either undergrad students or medical students who may be willing to come in and do this on a volunteer basis and create programs or initiatives that lean on that until you can create broader systemic changes that, with maybe the evidence you develop from that sort of intervention. So there's lots of ways to do that too. I'm already going over time, so I'm going to just wrap up there. But if you want to connect, feel free. But this is obviously work that we all are trying to do together. And then here are some of the various resources that if you feel interested to check out. But thank you for your time.
Can we use this as well? Is this an option? Sorry, I try not to stand behind the podium so there's not any barriers. My name is Katrina Gibson. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am Emory faculty at Grady, where I serve as our department's founding health policy fellowship director. And I am also ADIM president for another 24 hours or so before I pass on the reins to Shree's capable hands.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Cassandra Bradby. I'm the Residency Program Director at ECU Health Medical Center in Greenville, North Carolina. And for the next 24 hours, I also double as your immediate past president for ADIM and your incoming member at large to the Board of Directors for SAEM. So I'm excited this morning to kind of help close things out for you, talking about reaffirming DI in medical education. So we're going to give y'all a call to action and how to have some steps towards implementing the changes that you've learned about this morning.
I know that you all have all addressed some actions, but as we all know, kind of prayer, like words without actions are dead. So we want to give folks the opportunity to discuss this in more detail. Neither of us have any financial disclosures, unfortunately. Maybe next year that will change.
I am open to suggestions.
Yes. All right, so our objectives as we bring this to a close are to brainstorm potential next steps for participants to facilitate at their home institutions to promote DEI within their residencies, discuss stakeholders and how to incorporate large-scale cultural change, and we will review Cotter's principles of change management as small groups at our table. So the first step in change management is your needs assessment. What needs to change and why? I think we all kind of, all of those in this room are a highly self-selective group. We think that we know what needs to be done. However, what the chair of your department thinks needs to be done versus, say, the residency program directors, students and residents, et cetera, I think varies a bit. So maybe we'll only maybe do like a minute or so to, for each of the various steps, just out of respect for time. But think about what are ways in which you can actually measure what needs to change and why. What steps can you take? Because as we all know, you cannot change what you do not measure and or acknowledge. So what are some things that you think you can be done at your respective institutions, given the resources that you have, that could actually identify what needs to be done, and why, and who could best implement that. So it'll take maybe like 30 seconds, 40 seconds, and then someone from each table can report back.
So I know that this probably generated a lot of discussion because let's be real, we all have a lot of needs. And the more you talk about it, the more needs you find. But I think I hear him talking, that's probably not fair. So does anybody have like one specific kind of like thing they discussed in terms of like a needs assessment for their shop?
We discussed representation across the domains, starting with faculty, and also resident representation, student representation. And then we didn't get one.
Fair, that's fair. I will say that like when you think about your needs assessment, one of the things you really need to consider is also having some data to back you up. So if you have no data from your institution, you might want to like send out a survey. It don't need to be super intensive. Okay, we're not talking about we're going to submit the results to the New England Journal. We just need to have like enough so that when you go before some other folks to explain to them why you feel like this is a need, you have some data to support you because you'll get more buy-in, right? Because the next thing that comes after you figure out the need is getting buy-in from everybody else to support you in what you're trying to do. So I would say make sure when you consider your needs assessment, you also consider what data do you have to support that need. And if you don't have data, because let's be honest, there's lots of things that we're like, water is wet. How do I prove that? Like think about how you can get some supporting data for that.
If you build in time for it, like I was in the conference, give them the first 5 minutes to do it, they're more likely to respond than asking them to do it on their own time.
The next thing, and as we've acknowledged before, we realize that this is a little bit expedited due to our lack of time, but next, what are the main goals or objectives of your proposed change? Just like you developed objectives and goals for your didactics today, or I know a lot of us are directly involved in curriculum development, think about what some of the goals and or objectives that you may develop based upon the needs that you've identified in the last step. We'll give you a moment to talk amongst yourselves, and then we'll have a different table maybe share with us what that goal is and how you can also talk a little bit more about ways in which you can identify how that goal was achieved. All right. Give me another maybe 60, 90 seconds. We're EM docs, we're fast.
Safety and reporting. Sort of tried to do this reporting tool, which like
All right, I am going to refocus our attention. I know that we are moving through this with lightning speed, but if there is a table who would just like to briefly tell us what one of their identified needs was and maybe a goal and or objective that pertains to that need. Anyone? Don't be shy.
I think one of the goals we talked about was like developing a culture of like safety when it comes to reporting to care incidents in our department, because we have a tool right now, but it's not widely utilized. So my objective would be that the residents will identify that the culture of the department feels safe to report things like microaggressions and racism, and that they feel like their voices are heard and there's follow-up from that, essentially.
So I think that helps kind of like support what the next step would be. So when you come up with goals and objectives, right? I'm pretty sure that as educators has been beat like over the head because every single leadership thing you go to and most of the orientation things you get to being a leader at your institution probably talk about SMART goals, right? So anytime we come up with a goal, you got to think about, is it specific? Is it measurable? Is it achievable? Is it relevant? And then like timely. And so with Adam's goal, he was talking about like creating a culture. Creating a culture is kind of, it's in the ether. It's a very big goal, right? Like we're gonna create a culture. I think when we like think about our goals, like when we're trying to like sell this to our chair and stuff, the overarching goal is like to create a culture of safety, right? But then you got to have little goals that go under it that's like very specific, very measurable. By this date, we will have done this training so that these people understand what our goal is so that we can all work together for whatever our new state is. And then the next thing when we talk about change management is what is our desired outcome of the change? And so what does the actual outcome look like? So when we talk about culture change, what does that look like? What does that feel like? Like how, and then how do we actually achieve that? I think is kind of more specific in terms of like when we create goals, but really thinking about we can come up with some goals and then accidentally have a different outcome than the one we were going for. I'm pretty sure we've all come up with something that we thought was a really good idea, and then the outcome you're like, so that's not exactly what I was going for when I came up with this. So also think about what your desired outcome is when you try to implement this change, and make sure that's actually the outcome that you're going to get as best you can, because let's be real, no one can predict the future these days. And then start thinking about factors and forces that could affect that desired change. So basically, we're talking about what are the barriers. And sometimes, depending on where you work, but let's be real, we all work for healthcare institutions. So sometimes it's not just what is the barrier, it's who is the barrier. And then how do you get that person to be on your side so that they can also be a champion for change? And I think that's a big thing, is like getting all of your peoples together so that everyone can support the same goal. So have y'all hadn't noticed, like during the Rona, we had a lot of talks about not only change management, but we also started talking a lot about, let's have a mission statement. Let's have this. I felt like during that time, there was a lot of that. The residency needs a mission statement. The department needs a mission statement. And that needs to be in line with the institution's mission statement. This is what they were trying to do, actually, is this change management thing of coming up with a mission statement puts everybody in the same mind frame with the same goal. Now, we have different ways of achieving that goal depending on which department you are. But like that was their thought process when they came up with a lot of that stuff. And so then they sat down and started thinking about this. And that's why you got all the lectures about things about change management and whatnot, because they were starting to think about what are the factors and forces that could affect their desired change. And a lot of times that's us. And so how do they get us all on board? So the other things you could think about with factors and forces that affect the desired change would also be, I believe you talked about getting everybody on the team, nursing, as well as the residents, as well as the faculty, right? So living in silos is part of the problem when you're trying to affect change, is not everybody is on the same page about things. So trying to get all of those people aligned. The other big thing is, let's be real, dollars. So how do you get the dollars for whatever it is that you're trying to do? And if it's not dollars, it's time, and time is money. And so how do you get the time to do whatever it is that you're trying to do? And then whatever other things that you can think of. So right now my department is arguing about space. Like we don't have enough space in our department for all the people that work down there. And so one of our barriers is time. The other one is actual physical space. And so how do you create more space when you have finite space? How do you make it feel bigger than it actually is? How do you fit more computers places, things like that? And so our big barriers with a lot of that is like real ones. So who do you meet with? I need the people from facilities management. I need the people from finance. And actually having to sit down and write all of that out not only is super stressful, but it also makes you remember who else is part of the team that you don't talk to on a regular basis and who else you need on board in order to make change happen.
And of course, one of the other major barriers that we discussed and opened up with is the current regime, or the current administration's legislation has made it difficult for us to do what we do, what language we're allowed to use as well. Next, of course, is your personal characteristics that can impact change implementation. Of course, we are a diverse group with multiple talents and things that you bring to the table. Don't underestimate who can be a part of the team, who can be a champion for the types of change that you hope to implement.
I accidentally talked about this.
That's okay. There's overlap, and of course, we talked about personnel who are supporters, resistors, and maybes. Make sure that you identify who your allies are. They may pop up in unforeseen places with unforeseen titles, so make sure that you know who your network is and how you're able to manage them. I think maybe for the next slide, we can maybe allow folks another 60 to 90 seconds to kind of talk about the steps of implementing change. You know, as Cassie said earlier, there are some things that are a little bit more nebulous. If it's the culture, it's the mission, these are things that don't change overnight. But what are some of the steps of implementing the changes that you all identified earlier? I think we'll have time for maybe one other table to report back after you talk amongst yourselves and tell us what are some actionable items that you can take, whether it be in the next 30 days to 3 years, to implementing some of the goals and objectives that we talked about.
Which is when we have twice the number of leader because we're covering the context of license rate identities. And they put it on STEM days, so it takes twice the number of people to run a conference and communication. Just saying. So here's me replying to hey, moving forward, like consider not having this on Wednesday when no one's doing it, right? Historically, this is a difficult time. Right? And then are you very yeah, we definitely So in your conversations, what type steps have y'all come up with to help implement your planned change?
We said like identify the stakeholders and what's important to them. You have to align what you want to do with why they should care, and we're going to get any kind of like support and buying or funding or anything else for change.
I think the other nice part of getting your stakeholders involved is like when you make your list of steps to implement change, you'd be surprised how they can help add more steps that you didn't realize were there. Because sometimes the step that you listed, you're like, oh, that's one thing. No, actually, that's 5 things. So like, in terms of like, let's say you wanted to buy something for the department, that seems like, okay, buy XYZ for the department. That seems simple. No, that's actually not simple. That needs to go to your business manager, that needs to go to this finance person, that needs to clear this committee, that needs this thing in order for that to happen, blah, 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 blah. Which is stuff we don't deal with, right? Like I don't deal with any of that crap. I ask for, I want that and I expect it to appear. not how it work. And so talking to a lot of your stakeholders helps add the other things to the list so that you know like what you need in order to get to where you're trying to go. So whenever you come up with like goals and objectives, I think the next thing you need to do after that is actually start listing out the steps that you need in order to actually implement that change, and then assign those suckers. So like don't just make the list and then hope that someone in the ether is going to do it. That never works. So if y'all are on any SAM committees, one of the things you'll notice is that all the committees have goals and objectives, and they're all like they have red, green, and yellow stoplight things on them so that we know where they are in progress. And if you also look next to that, there's a column that actually says who's responsible for that. And the reason for that is so that way we can hold each other accountable to getting the things done, and we know what needs to get done. And so something like that is also very helpful for things like this. Our Division of Education actually has created our own dashboard. We sit down the end of every year and make the goals for the next year. And then we are now apparently implementing the stoplight system for the same thing so that we can all make sure that we achieve our goals for the year.
So this is just a little QR code. I encourage you all to use it. Hold yourselves accountable. We generated a lot of ideas, discussions, and tasks. So this will send yourself some of those ideas, whether it's 2 months from now, 6 months from now, or a year from now. Hold yourselves accountable, because we know that the work that we are going to be doing and the environment in which we do it is highly fluctuant. I know we don't have a lot of time for questions right now. However, I think that we are, of course, a highly selective group. We understand the importance of diversity, equity, inclusion in medical education. It impacts and decreases health inequities. It creates safe and brave spaces for our learners and for our colleagues. So I wanted to bring Sri back up and thank you all for all of your expertise and sharing your time with us.
And then just a plug, if you want to continue to do this work, where we do have our ADIM business meeting on Wednesday at 3:30. So definitely invite all of you to come and join, because definitely the work needs to go on even beyond this room to outside the world. But I just want to just thank you all. Definitely a big thanks to our speakers, but thanks to all of you for attending, and not only for showing up here, but for also the work that you do outside of these walls, because that's really where it matters for our patients and for our communities, and also for our society as well too. And I think, the whole idea of like reaffirming DEI is that there will be a lot of barriers that we will face, but we do this work not because it's comfortable, because it's always been uncomfortable, but it is necessary for our patients to advance the future for our country. And so continue to fight the good fight, take rest when you need it. I love that Katrina had taught me this, is that rest is active resistance. So please lean into that. When you need rest, take rest, but also then come back and show up to do this work again. So thank you guys so much for your time, and hope you enjoy your SAEM week. Thanks.